So welcome everyone to the Metacast. This episode, I'm very excited to be welcoming Dimes on as our special guest. To give a little bit of background, I was talking to Stormy, who, if you're frequent listeners of the podcast, came on, I believe is our third episode on finance. And he hadn't signed up as a paid subscriber yet. And I was like, hey, Stormy, why haven't you signed up? And he's like, well, you have to get someone good on, like Dimes. So I was like, all right, cool. And I searched your account and found that the Prudentialist was one of our mutual connections. And he was very kind to make the introduction. And so here we are. I've been listening to a little bit of
Can I just interrupt you for a second?
Yeah, go for it.
Pin in something for later. Dimes makes you dollars. Okay, go ahead.
So, yeah, I mean, I'm excited. If Stormy has a high opinion of you, he has a good nose for talent in our space. So it's always good to meet a fellow enthusiast on building parallel stuff and driving the movement forward in a practical way. That's obviously a large focus of my content, and that's what I hear is a big focus of yours as well. So the Prudentialist made the introduction, and so we don't know too much about each other, but I think that's great. We'll get a chance to explore it as we go. And I always find that there's usually a lot of overlap on things like this. We'll probably be running to a lot of ideas that maybe we express differently, but agree on, and finding some interesting nuance there. But, welcome to the Metacast. Excited to have you on.
I'm very, very excited to be here, and it's very great to talk to you. And like you just said, I got to know you a bit through your work as well. And it's very relieving to see someone who's talking about the same things that you are. I think a lot of people, their experience might be they're just kind of talking into the darkness, and they don't know if anyone's agreeing with them. And so over the past few months, I found more and more people who are on the exact same wavelength as I am, which is bad news because I thought I was super original. Turns out I'm not, but it means that, I got a lot of friends coming out of the darkness. So it's great to hear.
Yeah, I did a thread. It was like one of my earlier threads on Twitter, and it's called The Great Assembling. And the basic idea is that, there's this old recruiting question where if you were trying to meet a friend in New York City and you both lost contact with each other, but you're there on the same day, where do you go? What do you do? And in this case, the answer is effectively you go to Grand Central Station at noon. It's the epicenter. It's easy to get to. It's very iconic. And that's kind of what I think Twitter or X is, right? It's a lot of us as anons. We see what's wrong with the world. We want to fix it. We want to find other people like ourselves. And so we come to X. We kind of run up our flag. We create our content. We put out our message. We set our beacon. And, we end up kind of all gravitating towards each other and interacting and networking. And to your point, I think a lot of people basically are on a similar wavelength with a lot of these ideas. I like to think that truth is objective, and therefore the strategies inside the game of life are also objective, and optimized for certain situations. And so it's no surprise to me that I think a lot of us are coming to similar conclusions about what needs to be done, kind of encouraging people to be focused on self-improvement at an individual level, then focus on, in my mind, I'm a big believer in parallel movements. So creating alternative systems as opposed to trying to fix or to, break down the broken ones that are out there. And so it's been exciting kind of meeting a lot of people who are on that journey together. And I think, we're at that kind of assembling point where everyone's coming together and kind of starting to find out how they can synergize and work together.
Yeah. And you had mentioned something interesting there about, working on yourself on an individual level. And I find that gets lost a lot of the time. Because that's seen as, just to give an example, someone would say, oh, that's Jordan Peterson stuff. Oh, you want to clean your room and wash your dick. Or they'll say, don't worry about the little stuff. Don't worry about, relationships and working out or whatever it is. You need to worry about the big ideas. But then you just kind of lose yourself in that. And I really do think you need a baseline to work from. And I think a lot of people are kind of coming to the same conclusions, that we're getting lost in this highfalutin esoteric stuff, which is good. There's a good friend, a friend of mine named Culture Thug. I had him on the show, and he was calling back to, I don't know how far right you want to get with this, but he's hardcore.
We can make the decision to put it behind the paywall or keep it free tier. It's totally wherever you want to take it. So,
well, the idea of a cultured thug is a deep fascist idea. It was about, you can have all this theory, you can have all this sort of intelligentsia adjacent stuff, but at the end of the day, you need to be the cultured thug. You need the guy who's willing to put it into action. Thought in action is their big thing. And I find, especially in our current era, there's a lot of thought and not a lot of action, and for good reason. And I don't want to, sometimes I'm kind of doing a preamble here, because I want to say that oftentimes my criticisms or plans might sound like they're too critical of individuals. And I don't want to sound like that, because there's a lot of obstacles that people are up against. So just so listeners understand, as we talk, we're not trying to talk down to people or say that you all are lazy. That's nothing like that. Because I'm like everyone else, we're still kind of groping around here, trying to figure out the next strategy. And you had mentioned practicality, and I think that's crucial. And maybe we can set it up with this book I read recently that I end up talking about all the time. And a lot of our listeners like it as well. And maybe they're sick of me talking about it. But it's called Experiences in Groups by Wilfred Bion. And I'll try and give a succinct summary here. It's a psychology book, and a lot of people are turning off and shooting their screens already because they don't like psychology. But it's interesting, because this guy, he kind of emerged from the Freudian school, where psychology was traditionally one-on-one. It was the psychologist and the individual patient. And Bion was into group psychology, because he said our experience as humans is never just as an individual. We define ourselves in the context of groups. And no one had really done group psychology before him, not in any serious way. So this book was just some stuff that he learned about group dynamics from these experiments he had run. And in short, he found that there was two types of groups. He did this funny experiment where he would invite people to attend this meeting to figure something out, and then he would pretend that he didn't know what they were there for, and just see what they did. And a group would emerge. A group inevitably emerges, and a leader starts to emerge. It becomes this new organism. And they said there's two types of groups that emerge, very broadly. One was called a dependent group. One's called a work group. A dependent group would be a group that's kind of defined by these neurotic characteristics. And I won't go into all of them, but you'll be like, arguing over a leader, arguing over like your shared values. It's a lot of infighting, a lot of disturbances. But he said a work group is a group that still has strangers, still has maybe even a collection, an array of beliefs, but they have a mission, they have a goal. And he found that all of the neurotic tendencies that plagued the dependent group, who didn't have a mission, kind of were subsumed as long as they had something that they were doing. They had a goal that they could accomplish. And if anyone has been in the military, if anyone has worked a fucking job before, you probably know what that's like. A crew of guys maybe don't get along, maybe have different beliefs. I will say, as a caveat, there could have been a selection bias with these groups, that he didn't like smash together like a Haitian and a Muslim and like a Chinese Taoist. Like, it's probably like a bunch of like white Americans from Connecticut. And be that as it may, there might be some limitations of that, but be that as it may, I think that's where a lot of the people that I talk to are at, where they're like, what is a lot of the problems that are plaguing our groupings right now is just infighting. It's squabbling. It's just these groups that form and explode because they don't actually have a goal to accomplish anything. And goals are short term. Goals are always, a mission is short term. A mission has an end point, but then you need the next one and the next one and the next one. This is how every successful revolution is operated. This is how any successful business has been operated. And so I think there's people in various different sectors of the right, not everyone, because when we say, the dissident right, or the whatever this thing is, this thing of ours, as Thomas 777 would say, I speak very broadly. There's a lot of groups that don't get along. But as long as there's you can get a shared momentum with these groups that don't have a lot in common. However, I bet if most groups on the dissident right made a list of all the stuff they believe in, I bet we'd agree on 6 out of 10 fundamental things. That's my belief.
Yeah. Oh, I can tell we're going to get along. So there's a few things there, right? So the first thing you're talking about is goals, right? And this is a huge thing. So I'm actually just finishing an article now. Basically, I don't know if you've checked out my website, but one of the sections of my website is called The Journey. And the idea of the journey is to lay out in 5 steps what you as an anon, when you go through your awakening process, should be doing, should be focusing on. And so the first step is awakening. That's kind of having that realization that the world is not exactly as it seems. And I call that waking from the mainstream delusion. The second is framework building. It's like, okay, I'm abandoning this old way of saying the world. I need to create a new framework, a new way of understanding things. Where do I reestablish my foundation of truth, right? And that's obviously very difficult if you have no way of, kind of no new thing to trust. And that's the article that I'm working on now. The third step is self-improvement. And so we can talk a little bit about that. The step after that is creative works. So that can be making diaries or creating content online or whatever that is. But that's a way of exploring and kind of going beyond. And then you get into world improvement. So how do you make the world a better place around you? But that second step of framework building, as I was, what I love about writing is, for me, it helps me better articulate and structure the ideas that I have. And one of the realizations that I had in writing that was that the best way to start creating a new framework for understanding the world is establishing a new goal. And so I talk about this all the time, is when you are awakened from the system, it's not about system bad, let's go burn down system. It's the system, the values that it put in front of you was putting the group above yourself. It was putting, things that were very much not in your own best interests above you. And what you're really awakening from is these kind of bad goals, these bad aspirations. And the opportunity that you now have being awoken is you can redefine those goals. You can define them in a healthy way, right? And I very much believe in objective truth. I think that the goal of life is to flourish, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But that means the perpetuation of healthy patterns. So that's both yourself, if you consider yourself a healthy, positive person, but it's your family, it's positive structures, it's positive ideas, right? It's helping the world around you. So that is something to orient yourself towards. And that's why, self-improvement is the next step. But it needs to be focused, because if you don't have a goal, then it doesn't matter like what truth, quote unquote, you're learning. And that's the problem, is people get sucked down that conspiratainment rabbit hole. They get focused on aliens and all these other things. And it's like, well, that's not relevant, right? Your first step is self-improvement. You should set that goal. What does self-improvement mean to you? And then learn about all the things that you need to improve. You don't need to learn other things outside of that. And I think it's similar for that broader, our movement in general. When I think about what should we be doing, well, there's a lot of people who are wandering aimlessly because we haven't defined that goal very well. And in my mind, that goal is parallel movement. It is creating alternative structures in education, in finance, in socialization, in marketing, in all of these different fields, such that we as the vanguard are establishing this beachhead, and then those who awaken, they no longer are kind of wandering around in the dark. They have this light, this beacon that they can orient themselves towards and navigate, and they can become part of that parallel movement, and we can start picking up momentum and driving in a really healthy direction.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of individuals would probably be surprised at the power they can achieve, because it's very easy to get, I don't like using this term too much, but black-pilled, basically become nihilistic. That's what that means. Mm-hmm. And I was saying this to the Prudentialist just the other day, once you understand the enormity of the complexity of the issues and the scope of the matrix of all the problems facing you, it's hard not to drink. It's hard mm-hmm. not to give up or become self-destructive, or just, I'm plagued by thoughts of what I just want to go into the woods and lose my mind.
Yeah.
I just want to be an insane lighthouse guy, mm-hmm. But you eventually get out of that. Once you realize that, you'd be shocked at how much influence and power an individual can get. And a lot of the people who arrive in this scene, they arrive from different areas, but a lot of them are used to being loners, or they're used to standing outside. Maybe some are just straight up anti-authoritarian. Maybe them have some sort of dissidence in them. But, I think they end up feeling alone more than they should, or they think that, there's an issue, I think, on our side, which is we don't even know what it's like to win. Or we don't even expect our ideas to win. So I said this a couple of times before, and again, if people are sick of me saying this, then I don't know, die. But the idea is that
it's funny that you say that, because Stormy on our podcast, the guy who had recommended bringing you on, he has this short rant where he was like, the only question a philosopher should ask themselves is, should I kill myself? Should I commit suicide? Right.
Yeah.
And if the answer is yes, then, whatever, do it, as morbid as that is to say. But obviously the fact that you're still alive, that you're still trying, means there's some value to life. And, why not trying to optimize?
Well,
So,
and that speaks very personally to me because, my entire life, I've been a pretty depressive guy. I've been a pretty morbid guy. I think a lot of people are too, maybe now more than ever, especially the younger generations. But I presented myself with that problem because even when I was younger, I had sort of suicidal tendencies, but I said, am I going to kill myself? No. Okay, then what does that mean? There's something. You either kill yourself or you don't. And if you don't, then you're confronted with the reality of, well, where do I go from here? Because you always have the ability to kill yourself. And if you don't, that means you're clinging to something, and that means something. And you can dive into that, or you can numb it and mute that. But I think if you stare at that a bit longer, you realize, well, there's something maybe I feel like I'm here to do. Maybe there's something, or if you are going to kill yourself, maybe try a couple things before you do. And then you'll find out that you don't want to anymore,
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of people, like I said, now more than ever, I'm a millennial. I'm in my 30s, but I try and keep my finger on the pulse of Zoomers and Generation Alpha if I can. I don't know how old Gen A is, but hearing what they're going through, hearing the state of things for both men and women. I was just laughing the other day, like when I was a kid, we didn't have this thing called a fem cell. We didn't have just like a plague of weird unfuckable girls with like girl autism. Like that was like an alien species, but now that seems to be half of women. And I'm like, well, that means something. That's a problem. There's like there's a lot of incel girls. I don't know. Like there's something's misaligned in society. So I look at that. I'm like, well, these people can fall into despair, and I think there needs to be more roads out of that despair. And this is a bit of a ramble at this point, but I think there's more people doing that in a non-grifty way, because there's no shortage of people who will try and sell you supplements or sell you their fucking academy to get you out of that. But there's very few people who actually seem to be invested in trying to help people. And I'm seeing more of those people now, and that makes me optimistic.
Yeah. I mean, when I first came to the space, that's kind of what I realized. And this might be, we'll transition shortly into talking a little bit about, I always like to ask people what was their awakening experience like for themselves. For me, we talk about depression, talk about, being blackpilled and having a hard time. I hit that really hard. Right. I was just like, my whole reality came crashing down. Right. Once I realized that all of these institutions that I had put trust in, completely lied. The other thing for me is I grew up in a certain part of New England, as a white dude, and the people around me were very liberal. And so going through that awakening experience was even more difficult because I really didn't have anyone to talk to about what I was experiencing. Right. It was very hard. Everyone would either just outright reject it, or they call me crazy, or they ignore it. Right. And that's not a healthy place to be when you feel very justified in saying what you feel around, calling certain things into question. And so the only alternative is like, am I literally insane, or is everyone around me just so kind of just engrossed in this delusion that, that should also be terrifying, right? Is to think that you really can't have a conversation about what you're seeing to other people. And so a lot of what I tried to do when I first got on Twitter was to say, hey, look, we don't have a guide to help people going through that. Right. And there's enough people coming onto Twitter. I think that is a big reason why people come to Twitter, to come to X, is because they are looking to find other people who can say, oh no, I know what you're going through. You're not crazy. Right. And to have those conversations, at least initially. Right. And then the next step is, okay, well, then what do we do now? Right. Where do we go from here? Because it's not enough. I think it's a great first step to kind of be a community and to bring people in and to have these conversations and to shit post about all the ridiculous stuff. But then the question becomes, all right, where do we go from here? And I think at the very least, we want to promote self-improvement and positivity, but what are those broader goals that we should be aspiring to?
Yeah. Also, just on the Twitter topic, yeah, maybe this ties to our earlier point. There's way more of us than they would have us believe. Remember, I'm old enough to remember this didn't happen that long ago, but they had to shut down comment sections because there's too many of us just shit posting like the internet is inundated with guys like us if they just remove the barriers. Twitter is the same thing. And I don't know. Sorry, I interrupted you. I just want to let people know that don't fall into the trap of thinking that your ideas are actually that fridge. Most people, sometimes mine are. I got some really kooky ideas, but for most people,
I'll definitely give you a run for your money on that.
Yeah, but for a lot of people, there's a reason they try and keep people from us, because our ideas are attractive. They are more fun. They are more interesting. Sometimes they're a bit more disjointed and kooky, but that's interesting. Liberalism actually isn't interesting. And, some people will kind of get on my back when I say liberalism. I'm not talking about Enlightenment era liberalism, but, the status quo right now isn't interesting. Young people think having gay class is fun. It's funny. It's laughable. They're laughing at a lot of the stuff that's presented to them. And it's on the far right. Who are the people who are working out and getting into fights and doing, I think even on the, even Bronze Age Pervert and Curtis Yarvin sort of have their hands wrapped around this idea of vitalism. I think that's a good word. Do you see vitalism reflected in anywhere else? Not really, but there's something exciting about the way we do things. It isn't just edgy shit posting. That's part of it. But even a lot of the more extreme people like me are kind of tired of just old school edginess. Our edginess is far more bizarre now, but you know what I mean? But this is something that even girls could be interested in, and all the people aren't used to that. We're thinking this is a nerdy fringe thing. Not really. Not if you hand people the microphone. And that's why all of our ideas are kind of being adopted by the mainstream right now. And that's why a lot of the leftists are saying the right has all the money. I'm broke as shit, but they're onto something. They see maybe money and capital moving in a way they didn't expect. Anyway, I interrupted you there.
No, I love that. I mean, so one of my good mutuals, Arcology. If you've listened to my podcast, I think I've referenced him. One of my favorite other accounts out there, Space Age Maximalist Sam, had him on. They're both engineers, and so they did an episode that was talking about dirigibles and exoteric energy and stuff like that. But I met him in person. That's kind of part of what I do. Is I go around, I meet people, and when I met him, one of the things he said was, "We're more often hiding from our friends than from our enemies." And so that's a big part of what I believe. We're at this stage now where we have more momentum than I think we give ourselves credit for. There's more people, as you're saying, like us out there that are just kind of, they're keeping quiet. They don't want to rock the boat too much. But I think that as we start to create more of these beacons, more of these projects, and encourage people to get involved and make that easy for them to do so, you're going to see huge ground swellings of support. I remember it was not that long ago, there was that incident in New York where this that young curly-haired white guy ended up subduing a certain disheveled vagrant on the subway, and he got into a lot of trouble. I think the man passed away or whatever it was. But the amount of money he was able to raise in a GoFundMe, within the course of a couple of days, because of for his legal fund, I think it was $1 million or some astronomical amount. And it was well, that's a really good sign that, there's a lot of people who are keeping an eye on these things. And if something happens, there is support there.
Yeah. And again, those guys did cool things. Same thing with the Rittenhouse. And this was the interesting narrative I saw emerge, which was you saw a lot of progressives and left try and paint Rittenhouse as a blubbering sad sack. No, he shot 2 pedophiles. That's awesome. He didn't do anything wrong. And then they tried to, he extrajudicially did it. Oh, so courts are cool now? You're not cool. Shut up. A guy shot 2 pedophiles. The guy who choked out the guy in the subway, he looks awesome. He looks great in every single photo I've ever seen. He's a cool looking guy. And then when normal people see that, they're not pissed off that he choked the man to death. And a lot of people who are our opponents are confused by that. But you're supposed to not like that he was extrajudicially killed. No, they think it's okay. Yeah. And that's bad news for you motherfuckers, because it's cool, because people are just tired of accepting certain norms. And it turns out that people still, maybe this is what makes us behind the paywall, but people still think righteous violence is cool. Sorry. And guess what? Antifa doesn't read as righteous violence. It seems like gay nonsense to people.
Yep. Yeah. It's a joke. I mean, it's interesting. I don't. So I was a bit of a nerd growing up. I'm happy to admit it. And obviously, I'm also a millennial in my mid to late 30s at this point. And one of the, obviously I was big Batman fans, DC, Marvel, all that kind of stuff. Like when the Marvel movies were great, like, that was that in its heyday.
When I was a teenager, I worked in a comic shop. You don't have to make
right. I remember hearing that on one of the things. Yeah.
Dude, I get too deep into this stuff.
Well, and you were saying that some of it's really bad and some of it's really good. And one of my favorite DC animated movies of all time is I think it's like Under the Red Hood, or just the Red Hood, or whatever. It's the one where Dick Grayson comes back as the Red Hood, right? And and what I loved about that was not only did you have who was the guy from Supernatural who did the voice of the Red Hood in that one? You know who I'm talking about?
I don't know that exact reference, but
all right, I'll look it up. But so there's this did you ever see the Supernatural show back in the day?
No, that's the thing. I didn't see Supernatural. That's why I don't get
that. All right.
Well, I know Red Hood. I know the rest of the stuff though.
All right. We'll do like very, very quick. Let
me just say, in terms of comics, here, while you're looking, a lot of people are dismissed comics. When I was coming up, I was really into stuff like The Max. The Max is a tribute comic. There's this one that I could recommend. If people hate comics, have a look at this one that was published by Image Comics. It's called Nameless. It's a short run. It's not an ongoing series, beginning, middle, and end. But it's this. When I say Lovecraftian, when I say it's a space, like an eldritch space horror sort of thing. It's not like in a Reddit way. I'm not talking about a Reddit thing. Just look it up, read the first issue, and tell me that's not one of the coolest things you've ever seen. Anyone who's wants to hate on comics, there's a lot of bad comics, but I'm a big fan and friend of Dave Martell and a lot of those guys in the emergent pulp scene on our side of things, and they would probably make the same claim. Like there's old Conan stuff, get into Mars Attacks. That's always fun.
Yeah, I'll add that to the list.
My favorite was Scud the Disposable Assassin. That's my all-time favorite. That's what got me into comics when I was a kid. Anyways, I cut you off there.
No, that's great. I always love going down that rabbit hole because there's always great content in different mediums. But like the medium itself will get a bad rap as like kind of the quality declines across the board. But
well, it's like gaming. Gaming, there is the AAA titles, and the AAA titles of comics would obviously Marvel and DC. But if you're into computer gaming like I am, I got Steam. My whole interest is that whole underground indie game, really weird experimental stuff. And so in comics, like there's underground comics, not just Robert Crumb stuff, but there's really interesting stuff being done outside of, the stuff outside of Archie, which is always going to make money, and Marvel and DC, which doesn't even make money anymore. It's some kind of money laundering scheme as far as I'm concerned, but there's good independent stuff out there. I promise you.
Yeah, I think they just want to try to hold on to that as long as that they can, and so they're willing to kind of burn the furniture to keep the house warm. But yeah,
they're going to be an interesting canary in the coal mine because they've been operating at a loss for, I think, close to 10 years now. They're just not selling, and they've been kind of goosing the numbers. The way they count comic book sales, they count sales to the comic book stores, not people who buy the comics. So there's this inflation going on, but everyone knows that no one's buying these comics, and as a result, they're not seeing the movies. So I think if any of this, woke stuff is going to collapse, I'd be interested to see if the comics fall first, because they've been running on fumes for way too long, and they're scraping the bottom of the barrel on talent. I'm sure this is not what people want to hear on this. I apologize.
No. I mean, that's kind of what I like about having these conversations is like you kind of have to talk about culture, and like I'm sure we'll get into spirituality, and then the practicality of the movement, and then technology, and I'm on AI spaces all the time. Like it's so impossible to not kind of bleed the conversation into these other domains. But to kind of bring it back to so the movie's called Batman Under the Red Hood, right? And it's Jason Eccles is the guy I'm thinking about here. And yeah, he's from
this. That sounds familiar, that name.
Yeah. So he's pretty iconic. I'm sure you've seen some memes of him. But anyway, so he's the voice actor for the Red Hood. But the whole the storyline in the movie is that Ra's al Ghul, who's this kind of like mastermind secret assassin leader, orchestrates this situation where the Joker is supposed to distract Batman and Robin, but the Joker ends up killing Robin. He ends up killing Dick Grayson. And so Ra's al Ghul feels bad about this. He uses the Lazarus pit, the reincarnation machine. Well, it's mostly to revivify. So he uses it like every couple hundred years to make himself young again. And so they've never used it to, revive someone. And so they use it on Dick Grayson to revive him, but he goes crazy and he escapes. And so they don't know where he's gone. And then, later the Red Hood shows up in Gotham. And basically he's this character who takes over certain parts of the mafia. And, he tells them, don't peddle to kids, but I'm gonna own the mafia, and he's like killing people, right? And he's controlling.
Gotham never gets to just have a mafia, does it?
Yeah, it's always turmoil, but
always someone taking it over or taking it on. They can't just have a bunch of Italians in charge.
Yeah, no rest. But so he takes this over, and then he uses that as a way to the Joker's in jail, and he gets him out of jail. And the movie climaxes at this point where Batman is confronted by the Red Hood and finds out that he's Dick Grayson. And the whole thing is like, why did you let the Joker live when he killed me, and he's killed all of these people? Like, you have this ancient morality around like not killing people. And Batman's like, well, I can't separate, I can't cross that line, because once I do, then I can't do what I'm doing, right? And in my mind, so it's a question of like whether it's okay to kill, right? When is it justified? And Batman's obviously stance is I don't kill people. And the Red Hood is like, no, you should be able to kill the Joker, right? Like that yes. Seems like an obvious situation, right? And to me, what I love, that's the cool thing about comics, right? Is they should be exploring these philosophical questions and getting us to think about things. And in my mind, it's like, I'm obviously Team Red Hood. Like, there's no question about that, right? Like, why don't you kill the Joker, right? Knowing all the trouble that he can cause and stuff like that. And so I think that is, to me, that's kind of like one of the best stories, one of the best questions. And like, I want to see more of our guys kind of take over these different story things. I don't know if you've ever heard of The Drinker. He's a fairly big YouTube critic.
Oh yeah, a critical drinker, was that
the critical drinker? Yes, yeah. And so he's starting to create stuff, and I've talked to a lot of other people in the space, and I think that's like a big next step is we can talk about that philosophy. But to your point on like vigilante justice and all of those kinds of things, like I watched that and I was just like, yeah, Red Hood's way more badass than Batman. Like,
yeah. Well, there's a couple things to say there, because that's been Batman's line, except in Batman Returns, the second movie. He kills like 5 people in that movie with a smile on his face. That was the second Michael Keaton one. I'd say one of the better ones. But Batman always had this line that I thought was amusing. He was doing the thing that he does, like you just said. He's always ends up explaining to people why he doesn't kill people. And one of them was, if I kill a killer, the amount of killers in the world stays the same. And then you think about that and I say, well, what if you killed 2 killers?
Yep. You're
still -1 killers globally. And then hey, what about 3? What about 4? Like you solve that problem very fast. That is it's such a dumb piece of dialogue if you think about it for 2 seconds. But then also it really reveals what you were saying, which is like, there's this book we covered on the show by Ivan Ilyin. I believe it was I think an Eastern Orthodox Christianity book. It was On Resistance to Evil by Force. It was trying to address the question. He basically wrote it as an answer to Tolstoy, who I believe it was Tolstoy. Yeah, it was Tolstoy, who was also a Christian, but was sort of a radical pacifist to the point where if you resist trying to someone is attacking you, if you resist them, that is evil in itself. Any form of evil, any form of violence is evil, even in self-defense. And he wrote this book. I would recommend people read it. But the central argument is that you have a duty to utilize force to resist evil, to confront evil wherever you see it, and not kill it, but like interrogate it and try and treat it as the virus that it is. But he was saying that if you just let evil persist and hope that it'll, I don't know, run itself out, or that God will stop it, no, it'll spread until it eventually kills the host. Like the end of this is that it gets everything it wants and it kills the system or the civilization, whatever it is. But you need to confront evil, and so it was sort of a treatise towards Christians, like don't be afraid of picking up the sword, which has happened throughout history. But it all comes back to Batman. Like, are you allowed to shoot Joker in the head if doing that saves the lives of 50,000 people? How many people has Joker killed wantonly? Men, women, children, all of them. Like, it is, and in
sadistic ways too.
Yeah,
it's like
he's a virus that's aware he's a virus. He's like a criticism of your antiviral behavior. So that's why I think what's interesting is the Joker. A lot of people see the Joker as a bit of a meme, but I think it's fascinating how the Joker, whether you like him or not, whether you think he's a tired character or not, has somehow emerged as like the archetype of our era. Like there's been way too many Joker movies in movies. Yeah. There's been such an acceptance of the Joker as a character that people want to emulate in a non-ironic way, which is strange to be like a psychopathic clown. But that says something about maybe our generation, but it seems to cut across generations. I don't know. I just think there's no meta narrative about why the Joker from Batman has reached like the apex of our culture the way.
I have an answer for this. Right. I think that movies are largely predictive programming nowadays. I think you can kind of see that a lot. You see the Civil War movie that's coming out soon. But in my mind, one of the things that's severely lacking from the mainstream is a healthy male role model. Right. And I think you even have talked about this in one of the podcasts that I was listening to. Right. Basically all of the men in the space are like effeminate. Like we grew up in the Longhouse. A lot of, our male role models are kind of effeminate and weak. Right. You look on any of the TV shows and the husbands are kind of bumbling fools that the woman has to like put up with and tolerate. And so like for them, what they're very happy to not have that positive male role model and uphold the only alternative archetype, right, is this kind of like destructive nihilistic force, right? They're literally just saying the only alternative to society is the black pill. They're not really holding up a positive male role model, and that to me is the next kind of wave of media that needs to be created. I'm actually batting around an idea for a story right now that would talk about if you were like a base to tech founder, because I've worked in tech for a while now, and especially navigating recent tech with COVID and vaccine requirements and all of like the woke marketing and all of those kinds of things. Like, how do you push against that in a healthy way? How do you kind of coexist with one foot? And the way I talk about this is one foot in the parallel movement, right? Trying to create good and healthy alternative structures and pursue and orient yourself towards those objectively healthy values, but also have one foot in the mainstream delusion and realize, hey, I don't have full agency. If I decide to do certain things, gloves off, it's a trade-off. It's not an optimization. It's not always the right decision. And so how do you walk that balance? I think like having someone to establish that ideal, establish that role model of someone trying to navigate that middle line of what I call being a master of both worlds, right? It's that Campbell's hero's journey idea of, how do you live in both worlds simultaneously? I think that is desperately needed. And that is part of why, you have these kind of weird versions of this. You have the Jordan Petersons, you have the Andrew Tates, right? But I think that the more practical incarnation is something a lot less cartoonish and a lot more real. And
Yeah. Well, you said something there that I was going to mention this earlier, and I totally got steamrolled by myself. But you had mentioned growing up, you in a very, very liberal area, and I can relate to that because I'm in Canada. So
yeah,
that's, our conservatives are basically your Democrats down there. And so anyway, but the point being that what I found interesting when considering, I'm just going to call them liberals. We jokingly call them libs around here. What's interesting, if you actually look at libs, it is sort of a dialectic in itself. Like when you live within that world, those people are living in two worlds themselves. There's the one they profess of the liberal worldview, but liberals have this really interesting revealed preference that a lot of conservatives and people on the right have been calling out for like decades now, which is like, oh, you talk about diversity, but you don't want to live around Black people. You don't want your kids going to these schools. Like you don't, live by your own rules. And that is true. And so they are living in this. It's hard to live like that because you're not living in the truth. You're living in saying one thing and doing another. So to operate within that paradigm where you're trying to create a parallel world, living in that world really does drive you insane because you're always lying and you always know you're lying. And that's what's interesting about the DEI stuff, like the diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff. Like everyone kind of knows that, there's some true believers there, but a lot of the times it's there to just wallpaper over losses. It's like an excuse. It's this thing. How many people actually believe in this stuff versus they're just saying they do? However, saying it doesn't help anyone because there are true believers out there, but it's living in a maddening world that I can't recommend to people, but you have to do it. So by living in two worlds, you're almost living in three worlds at the same time. And that extra level of complexity is kind of maddening to people. Sorry, I think I interrupted you.
No, this is great. This is it's funny. So I do a weekly space on Sundays on X, and we go for usually an hour, maybe two sometimes, and we do different topics all the time. And I like the space environment because you can pull people up, you can have conversations, you can share thoughts. It's a little bit more dynamic. But one of the ones that we recently talked about was how do you balance that, right? And one of the things that I talk often about is this idea that we live in both a material and a spiritual world simultaneously. They're like superimposed on top of each other. And a lot of the psyop around the material world is to say things like, well, if you're a good person, you're not going to seek power because only, evil people seek power, or power corrupts absolutely. And, money is the root of all evil and all of this kind of stuff. And it's like, all right, sure. But if you say that all the time, right, what you're basically doing is you're telling all of these good people who don't want to be seen as evil people to not do those things, to not become powerful, to not seek material wealth. And the only people that you're going to get seeking those things are now all the evil people, right? And that's what kind of leads us to the situation that we're in now. And so I encourage people all the time, no, seek material wealth, seek power, but don't seek it as the ends in and of itself. Seek it as a means to higher spiritual aspiration, right? That you can have more reach if you are successful. You can have more agency when you are more successful. And so that, the thinking about like tech, right? If you're a salesperson and you're making a shit ton of money for your company, if you're, strong and you like I had a tech company I was a part of, and during the Roe v. Wade stuff, they were like, everyone has to wear green to support, all of our women's rights and stuff like that in the office. And I was just like, fuck, like I either have to go in wearing green or everyone's going to be like that bastard, Yeah. And so, but like, if you're making a lot of money for the company, you could just be like, fuck you, no, I'm not doing it. And they're like, okay, well, I guess we can't fire you, right? We'd be like mad at you, but it's just, but the ideal thing, and this has kind of been the path that I've been on, is like, okay, well, become an increasingly more competent person, and then you can go out and start your own business, or you can, find other ways to make money that don't require you to rely on other people. And so that is a big part of that self-improvement path, is the less reliance that you have on other people, the more you can self-actualize towards your towards your goals.
And also, if you are in a position of authority like that, your confidence will spread mimetically through people, because there could be a great number of people who also don't want to wear green, but they're not in the position where they can say anything. But you could be a center of gravity if you put yourself in that position, and you'd be surprised how often you can be a center of gravity by saying something that no one has said before. I'm not encouraging people to like risk everything with this, but oftentimes the people who find themselves in these spaces tend to be the most likely to be the ones to be the first to do something like that.
Yeah.
But every time I've done that, every time like I've tried to push back and say this is fucking dumb, most people will be like, yeah, it is, or they'll talk like they agree with it, but the moment you say, do you? They're like, no. Because they never thought about it. They're just parroting something.
There's this really prolific meme of it was like something on a 4chan board that I think really encapsulates this idea. And it was basically like high testosterone men and like Sigma males are the only two people who can have real opinions, because the way that they approach forming an opinion is they look at something, they say, is this true or not? The problem with everyone else, you have the midwits, is they are very socially conscious. And so the way that they assess truth is not, is it true or not, is if I held this view, how would the people around me think? Right. And so I think, like, to me, that's kind of the thing, is like everyone thinks that the other people around them have that view. And that was very, I was going into, the city for work during the pandemic, and I would ride the train all the time, and I would not wear a mask. I like refused to do it. And it was one of those things where I sat down and like people around me on the train be like, oh, that guy's not wearing a mask, and then take theirs off, and it was like such an interesting time. It's such an interesting time, because like normally you're just on a train, everyone's, got their, no one's like wearing masks or anything like that. So, but it was like such like a physical manifestation of like ideology and like contagions and stuff like that. It was really interesting to kind of observe that.
Part of living in an atomized society is people they don't even remember what it's like to live in any sort of community like that, or like-minded people. So when they see it, there's an immediate connection there. That's interesting. And, it occurs to me that, oftentimes I try and look at the people who have certain beliefs, because there's certain personality types that are attracted to certain beliefs. Like us on the right, there's a lot of people who are very, disciplined. They're very duty oriented, but there's also a lot of just insane psychos over here. Let's just be honest. And we're pretty good at sorting through that, but we're not perfect. But one thing that you notice is that I forget where I was going to go with this. I think I forgot. Oh no,
we were talking about the masks and the train, and
I was going to say the idea is that if you hold these really challenging ideas, I think one thing that comes from that is you're very confident. There's a lot of confident people on this side. There's a lot of people, for better or worse, who think they're the shit. As a result, they're not really concerned if they look stupid to someone else. So I'm not, for me, like with COVID or anything, I'm like, I think this is dumb. Tell me why I'm wrong. Hey, I'm an idiot. Okay, I get it. Get all the women in the office into a semicircle around me and tell me I'm a bad guy. But here's the thing, I bet you can't. I bet no one's ever asked you to explain what you believe. And this is my experience with most people. They actually don't hold these as beliefs. I mention this all the time. So, and then another fucking thing I mention all the time, but
that's okay. That's where we're like old men. When you've talked about enough ideas so many times, you're like, I say this all the time. This is a drum that I beat. But it's also the worst when you're like just starting to meet people.
Yeah.
Because the first time you meet someone, you're like, okay, cool. Like, let's share all of our ideas we've never talked to each other about. But the worst is when you've like known someone for a little while and you're like, have I told you this before? I say this all the time to everyone, but I don't know if we've covered that ground yet.
It reminds me of this character called the Red Hood. You ever heard about that? But the idea is I'll just wrap this up quickly. Like if you are more adept at someone explained to me, they've never had to explain these ideas before. These aren't actually beliefs that they hold. Most people don't even feel that confident about them. And so the definition of propaganda, that's what I was getting to. My preferred definition of propaganda was by Jacques Ellul. And there's a few books written about propaganda. Edward Bernays wrote one. I like the Jacques Ellul one, because a lot of people talk about propaganda just as if it's a extra loud advertisement. But I like to look, the way Jacques Ellul described it was, it's a belief that sort of sits above your actual beliefs. It's something that it elicits a Pavlovian response that, for example, the example I always give is like, if you're in church, I'm a Catholic. I don't know if you are, but
I'm God-pilled. I'll put it that way.
So an interesting thing happens in some churches if you're sitting at mass and something about homosexuality comes up and you're a Catholic, you're not really supposed to like that. But there's this sort of pall that goes throughout the audience that you're not supposed to say that. Now, you can believe homosexuality is against God. You can have all these beliefs, but a propagandized individual has this operating system that sits above that triggers that sentence that you're not supposed to talk about that. We're not supposed to talk about that. So it's not even something you believe. You just know this is what I have to do. And in fact, I will attack anyone that agrees against that. And that's my programming right now. And it has nothing to do with faith, has nothing to do with logic, has nothing to do with anything you read anywhere. It's just you have this sort of cognito hazard that you witnessed, and it's just with you now. That's what a propagandized individual is. That's why you can't really argue it away. That's why you can't confront it and interrogate it like that, or attack it logically.
Yep.
They just feel it. But sometimes, if you get them in a room and say, explain to me why I need to do this, they actually can't.
Yes.
So it's this very interesting interplay there.
Are you familiar with egregores?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Is it EREGORE, or is this a different thing? Yes.
Yes. So one of the episodes that I've planned is going to be with Stormy Waters, my good friend, and we're going to talk about the science of spirituality, right? And one of the ways that I think about these things is that these people are literally possessed by these ideas, by these egregores, so they've kind of given up agency, right? To your point, they can't explain why. Right. It's the Jungian idea that people don't have ideas. Ideas have people. And so these people are just literally extensions of their ideologies. Right. You can think of these as gods. You can think of these as spirits. You can think of these as egregores, right? Demons, or whatever you want to think of it as. But that, in my mind, is basically what we're dealing with. Is you've seen studies where it's like 70% of the population isn't really sentient. They don't have internal monologue. They can't visualize things, that kind of stuff. Yeah, they're facilitators for these egregoric ideas. And so when I think of things like that, where you're basically programming. I mean, that's why the NPC meme is so prolific. Is swap in new programming, and they don't. To your point, they don't understand why. Right, they can't justify it, and that's why when I do talk to people about what are good strategies for interacting with people in the mainstream delusion, it's you never take a position, you never say that thing that's going to trigger that Pavlovian response that you're talking about. You just ask them questions and get them to reflect. The other thing that I often recommend too is become the best version of your ideology. That's a far better way of converting people than going out and trying to scream them down into kind of accepting that they're delusional or whatever it is, because we're at the stage, especially now, where we don't need to go out. We need to aggressively wake people up. What we need to do is we need to set these beacons of what can be achieved, right? To your point, that vitalism, right? I've been lifting aggressively for like the last 2.5 years, and drinking tons of raw milk. I'm a big fan of like raw egg nationalists and a lot of that stuff, right? And that's when I talk about self-improvement, that's what I talk about. Be vitalist, right? Live towards flourishing, and kind of do those things. But
you mentioned there, I just want to say before I forget, and that ties into just what you're saying. I ask a question to people and I say, what if everyone who can be red-pilled has been red-pilled? What if the red pilling is done, and anyone like the person you say, we call them the shape rotators. There's people who have an internal monologue, and for people, the folks at home, if you can close your eyes, if you could imagine a shape like an apple in your mind's eye and rotate that, if you can, you're part of I don't know what the percentage of the population is, but it's less than you would think.
Yeah.
So realize that an example of what we were just talking about was during COVID, an interesting type of guy made himself known. It was the guy who was wearing the mask, but not over his nose. And I'm looking at that. I'm like, what is this? What are you like? You know that you need to do this, but you don't believe in it, but you're doing it anyway. It's a bureaucratic sort of thing, but you're mad at people if they don't do that the way you're doing it, because the way you're doing it also doesn't work. But it's like you're a type of guy. I don't even know if that guy can be red pilled. I don't know if that guy can see any sort of video that's going to crack him from the system. Our job is to figure out, are we talking to one of those guys? Because those guys will come along later. Once they see that there's a new center of gravity and a new norm being established, they'll come along. They just go whatever way the fucking wind's blowing. You don't need to fight a war for every single mind.
Yeah. Have you read Crossing the Chasm?
No, I haven't.
The chasm. I always pronounce that, and I get yelled at by people.
No, guess what?
It's a marketing book.
I'm Chasm. I'm going Chasm all the way.
Chasm. Yeah. All right. Yeah. But it's a marketing book, and it talks exactly about this idea that you have different levels of adoption when it comes to new technology. You have your people who are already kind of in that space. They're like eager to kind of jump in on new technology. You have the people who are they're willing to be the early adopters, but they're a little bit more hesitant. And then you have like the conservatives who are like, I'm not going to jump in unless other people around me are jumping in. And then you have your late adopters. Those are the people that are trailing, right? And I think to your point, you made a point earlier, and I kind of gave like the like sign to it, which was, you said the goals are short term, and I actually disagree with that. And kind of aggressively too, because in my mind, I think that the problem that we have is we're not thinking long term enough. Right, we're thinking too aggressively. Everyone's like, running out and like scream from the rooftops that everything is like fucked and the media is lying and all this kind of stuff. I think that the plan should be a little bit more like, we're in the early stage. We're pioneering this new space. We're going out. We're building frontier outposts, right? Like what Lomez is doing with Passage Prize, and you got Ren doing with Man's World and all that kind of stuff. Those are forays into this new space that need to establish, they need to grow, they need to be cultivated, right? But as they build and pick up that momentum, it's going to be that how did you go bankrupt? Well, slowly at first and then suddenly all at once, right? We're going to get to that point. But I think that if we're thinking about things in the long term, and we're thinking about right now, to your point, it's like, we shouldn't be expending a lot of energy trying to red pill more people. Sure, there's ways that we can kind of do that in the 2080 rule. We can meme and do all that kind of stuff and pull more people into our space. But right now it's about, we need to like assemble the Primarchs, the 40K stuff, like bring everyone together and start like really trying to network, build relationships, build that trust, and then we can start to
let me just clarify. What I meant by the goal thing was, if we just imagine it within the framework of a war, there's the war, which is winning the war is the ultimate goal, but then there's the battle, or then there's the mission. So like Man's World would be a mission. That's something that you could start and then accomplish. But what they're fighting is a larger war, which is to fix the culture.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
But if you break it down to actual missions have the beginning, middle, and end. It's like, I'm going to start a magazine. And then he does that. He started Man's World, but then the next mission is, how do I grow it?
Red is such an animal. That guy's always writing all the time. I'm actually, we're thinking about, you kind of took a dig at supplement lines. We're going to start a supplement line with Ren soon. One of my buddies is he's an MD. He's had his own practice for a while. He really knows his stuff. He's like a based like doctor that's been pursuing like true medicine for a while. And so he's going to be, we're going to be starting that line soon, and Ren's going to be actually endorsing us, and he's been working with us to kind of formulate the supplements, and we're going to be launching that. So
I'm working on something similar. Me and a couple guys, we were trying to answer the question, what happens when you combine dick pills with Adderall?
Have you met Lucas? Have you met
Those are two great things that go great together. No, Lucas Gage, or is this a different Lucas?
No, Schizo Freak on Twitter. Lucas, he's got the Milady thing. He did the Roman Towel Boy meme. He's one of there was like 3 people who did that, but like his went the most viral. I don't think he was the first.
Sounds like my kind of guy.
I was just about to say, like, so he's doing his own supplement line with another group, and their whole thing is like, they're kind of the polar opposite of us. Like, we're really into the medicine and the formulation and all that kind of stuff. They're kind of just like, how aggressive can we be with like certain ingredients? Like, it's like, what is like the legal limit that we can put in these things? So yeah, you'd get along well with him. We did an episode, I think he was the 5th episode that I did. And we ended up talking about, like a ton of things. We went to like 5 hours. Like I'll call Lucas up and we'll have like 7-hour conversations just about random stuff. He's like, the guy is literally one of the most brilliant people I've ever talked to. But yeah, so we got on this tangent because I think Ren's an animal. The guy is just always creating great content. And to your
guys
point,
like
just
that,
has a mission.
it's like, especially if you're running a publication, it's like, okay, what's the next mission to grow it? And you can kind of, you have a 5-year plan, but you also think quarterly. And I think we probably have a lot of commonalities because we didn't discuss this at the top, but I do work in marketing and I've worked in startups for a couple of years. I worked at a startup incubator in Toronto, Canada, and I worked with quite a few startups, and I worked in the tech space, a SaaS company. That's software as a service for people who aren't dorks like me. So I'm maybe not as familiar as you, but I have some familiarity and a very deep interest in that space. I know a lot of people in our scene are kind of aggressive toward that sort of thing, but I'm not. We talk about it quite a bit. Anyway, I was going to ask you before we go on. There was a book we covered by Marco Popic called Geopolitical Alpha, and he's an interesting guy. And he's a finance guy and a geopolitics guy. And he had made the claim that I agree with, but I'm curious to hear what you say, that he said SaaS is effectively dead as an investment. That it's not the Wild West exciting place that it used to be. Money is moving out of software as a service, or the big players that are there will probably remain. Like there's always going to be a Salesforce, there's always going to be Adobe Creative Suite, whatever it is. But like the smart money isn't going for like the next sexy 10x scrappy thing. And I have a few ideas on why that is, but I think it just became too full of scams. But just off the top, your gut reaction to that claim, what do you think about that?
It's funny because it's hard for me. I haven't thought about that as a kind of a concept. I do think that, to your point, right, like the main areas have kind of been taken over. So I used to work in recruiting. I'm now in sales, right? You've got CRMs like HubSpot and Salesforce that are pretty standard, but you also have some smaller ones out there. Recruiting, you have Lever, Greenhouse are usually the two main ones, and then you have a bunch of others. And when new startup starts, you're for me, it's like, okay, I have to build my my talent engine here. We're gonna build our recruiting tech stack. We're gonna get our ATS, our applicant tracking system. We're gonna get like, we have to buy LinkedIn Recruiter because they fucking extort you, and then you have to get a bunch of other stuff. And so to me, I think you're right that there's like certain things that are established. The question becomes, okay, well, like for SaaS, it's like, what new things are you trying to support? Because it's like you can't take on the incumbents unless they get lazy or something new comes out. So yeah, you could be right in that regard. I also think that one of the things that happens with markets is they solidify into like a single thing, and then they break apart, right? And then the reason that they break apart is because usually that becomes too like monolithic, too over focused, right? Like you can see this with, for example, Amazon and Chewy, right? So like Amazon used to sell a lot of like dog food and other stuff like that. But because they were trying to do everything, they didn't have a marketplace that was really focused towards pet owners, and it was easy for a pet owner to navigate. And like one of the things that Chewy did, and obviously I'm a big Chewy fan because you have what's his name, Cohen, who now just like bought GameStop, and you had that whole thing back in the end of 2021. But one of the things that Chewy did was they would send like flowers if a dog passed away. Typically, people had subscriptions on their accounts, and usually what happened is they'd get an order in, and they'd call the people up and say, hey, I have to return this, and my dog passed away. And the customer service people were always super friendly. They were always like, don't worry about it. just donate it. It's totally fine. You don't need to send it back. And then they would send flowers to the person and say, hey, we're really sorry for your loss. We care about you as a customer. You can't do that as Amazon, right? You can't have that level of specificity and catering. And so I think that is kind of a phenomenon. Like I'm big into meta patterns. Who would have thought with the name of Meta Prime? But so I do think that will happen. You'll have this consolidation and breakdown. But I think you're right in the sense that it's hard for me to see someone coming in and trying to create like a new sales CRM or something like that.
Yeah. What's interesting is I can also relate that to streaming services. That there's a proliferation of streaming services. There's a few titans. There's your Amazon Prime, but then there's this little pygmy thing called Shudder, and Shudder is just for horror. And the fact that they similarly found a market that is heavily monetizable, because there's certain markets that's just where the money is, and they're very committed and they love their thing. And it turns out that you can have a dedicated streaming service just for horror movies because there's that many horror fans, and you might not be able to do that with sci-fi. I think they thought they could do that with sci-fi, but I don't think they can. For some reason, the money is more on horror for men and women. And that's just something you only notice if you give a shit about demographics and how demographics spend money. And so the Chewy is like, who spends a lot of money? It's very passionate and very loyal. It's pet owners.
Yep. Yeah.
And that's the type of stuff I'm interested in too.
Yeah. I mean, I find this stuff really, really cool. I mean, and the other thing too is a lot of the content that I create, I pull a lot of my thoughts from the tech space, because in my mind, what they're doing in the tech space, the approaches that they have, they are, forced by the market to optimize in a very practical and real and truthful way. Obviously there's parts that don't make sense, like DEI and whatnot, but for the most part, it's well oriented. And so when you have things like agile methodology and lean methodology, and you have, I don't know if you've ever read Elijah Goldratt's The Goal, which is basically workflow optimization. If you understand those strategies broadly as meta patterns, you can apply them to anything. You can apply them to your personal life and how you improve your life. You can take the strategies for building a startup and use that to create parallel movements. You could do all of these really like amazing things with those patterns. So I think it's a very fertile ground if you want to learn very practical intellectual tools that are going to help you in the world.
Yeah, I've discovered that when I took a course on lean manufacturing, the lean model. It's Japanese manufacturing methodology that goes a bit too far in my opinion, but it's about reducing waste. And it's about looking at the entire process of your system, mapping it out from beginning, middle, and end, looking at each segment and seeing where are the likelihood of breakdowns, where's the time being wasted, and just maximizing for efficiency at every single point. Now, the problem there is that it seeks to reduce or destroy all redundancies, so that this is where like just-in-time manufacturing comes in. But that creates problems, because if there's any sort of pause, the entire fucking system breaks down. There's no stockpile of anything, and then it's a catastrophe. However, the idea was that if it's a perfectly streamlined system, there's zero waste, and then you don't need to have any overhead really. But you could see how that goes wrong. But anyway, it's a different way. You could still apply that in very key areas of whatever human organization you're doing. Just don't make that your only thing.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure as a video gamer, you'd appreciate this analogy. That's like the glass cannon method, right? It's like, I'm gonna max out my DPS. If I get hit by like, the little sewer rat guy, like gets one hit on me, I'm dead. But like exactly. I can take down the biggest boss, as long as I, can kite them or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
So it is dangerous. It's funny. Elon Musk gave an interview recently. I think this was on Rogan, and he was talking to Rogan about the Cybertruck and designing the Cybertruck. And one of the things that he said that really stuck with me was, designing the Cybertruck was very difficult and impressive, but really it was the production process for the Cybertruck. And I think, that's really the cool thing. Like Space Age Maximalist, one of my good mutuals on X, and you'll meet. I added you onto the group chat. You'll meet these guys soon enough, get to know them a little bit. But he's literally a rocket scientist, He's a space engineer. And so we kind of geek out about these things. We were talking about this, and what makes that so amazing is that the space for innovation when it came to designing and building cars was not the cars themselves. It wasn't trying to optimize those, although they did find some really creative ways to do that, right? If you look at the Cybertruck, and the reason that it has that weird kind of rectangular or kind of triangular shape is because that the whole car structure is actually load bearing, whereas if you look at a normal truck, it's just the bed of the truck is actually the load bearing part. So cool stuff like that. But when they were building designing it, they thought about the manufacturing process broadly, and so they were doing things like if we're getting these sheets of metal in at these certain lengths, then how does that work with how we're constructing the car? We don't have to like weld sheets together to because then we'll have structural weak points. So they were thinking a lot about how the design of the car and the production that, and they also think about like the whole system, right? They're trying to vertically integrate as much as possible. And so they found all of these ways to increase all of these efficiencies and just build these things way much faster, way more effectively. And it's really cool. There's this like hour and a half long YouTube video where I forget the name of the guy, but they walk through. He's got like all of the head engineers from the different, electronics and design and production, and they just walk through the whole thing and they're talking about it. And it's just like the biggest nerdgasm you're ever going to have. It's fantastic.
Well, I love that stuff. And in our space, there's a lot of people who don't like Elon Musk, where they would look at the Cybertruck and say,
I am a huge fanboy.
Yeah, well, they look at the Cybertruck
that
that's stupid and he's an idiot. I'm like, okay, like let's take a breath here.
I just don't get that take.
Let's assume for a second Elon Musk isn't an idiot.
Yeah.
Let's assume that he knows what he's doing and he's got a pretty good proven track record. If I see something that looks immediately dumb to me, but it's by someone who seems to know what they're doing, I'm like, okay, where am I wrong?
Yes.
Tell me what I'm missing. And so the Cybertruck, when you said every aspect of it is load bearing, I'm like, oh, that's fucking awesome. I get it now. I immediately get why that's interesting.
Why it looks
yeah. Well, also it's fuck it. Like every car looks the same. That's the people who complain about the Cybertruck will hit you with, why does every SUV look the same? Because no one's taking big design swings like this anymore. When's the last time everyone looks at everything from the 70s? Like everything was amazing back then. Yeah, well, then there's this. Maybe here's a new thing. I find that at the very least interesting.
Yeah, my whole thing with Elon is exactly the same as yours. It's like, look at the guy's track record. To say that this guy is making like I'm not saying he's always just going to make the best decision all the time, but at the very least, if you have a decision that he makes that you disagree with, you should be thinking he probably knows something I don't, or he's probably weighing some other consideration that I'm not aware of. Like
every step of the way, when he was trying to like dig tunnels in LA, I think it was, he started the Boring Company. Yeah, it's like, oh, he's wasting his money on how to dig holes. I'm like, well, that's, if you listen to why he's doing that, thinking subterraneously, like that's a very interesting way of trying to
very
solve
timely conversation about tunnels.
Yeah. Well, it depends if you want to. There's so much to say about that. I mean, we had a policy on our show that we break all the time, which I don't like to comment on developing stories, but I'm like, this one, there's just so much. Everything I learned about it, I'm like, it connects to all this other stuff, and there's like Epstein stuff happening too. Like this is,
oh man,
it's a convergence of wild shit.
We can have you on the podcast to talk another time about kind of the more spicier stuff. But literally, one of my good friends, he's in that area. He was like, dude, that's like a 10-minute walk from where I am, and so he like just headed out, and he was like taking pictures outside the place and sending them to the group chat. And it was just
someone I saw a tweet, and this could be all we say about it because I don't want to get you in trouble. But there's one tweet I read, and I believe this is real. He's real, huh? But there's this guy like from a year ago who's saying, I'm living on the first floor apartment. I hear people speaking Yiddish beneath my floors. Yep. What is going on? And then he's like, I knew it. But I'm like, that is such a funny fucking callback. I love this site. I love life again.
Dude, yeah. No, it's so there's this great memes that have been popping up too, where it's like, you thought 2023 was crazy. Like it's like 9 days into 2024 and we're getting like, Jew tunnels
also,
and
everyone's like, everyone's kind of black pilled. I'm like, ever since Trump got elected, I've loved every year. There's been some wild shit that's happened every year. Remember the submarine thing, guys? Remember that? That was pretty crazy.
Oh yeah, that guy was like, I'm not hiring white people, and then it's like, oh well, your submarine imploded.
Hey guys, remember when the government like a few times said there's UFOs? I knew that was kind of crazy, right?
Oh yeah, I think they're gonna that's a whole other.
I'm introducing and planting tangent seeds all around here.
Oh yeah,
must not let them grow because I think we were on a good crest of a wave there. I completely forget what it was.
Well, we were talking about tech and meta patterns and just nerding out about that stuff. One of the things that has occurred to me earlier, and this is going to be like a huge throwback, so I'm sorry, this is going to be kind of jarring for some of the listeners, but you were talking about groups, and I also do want to get to talking about your awakening experience if we can work that in.
Of course, we'll get to the first thing eventually, but keep going.
Yeah, people are like, when are they going to talk about that? So you were talking about groups. So when I was in college, for my we do a large paper in our senior year, and it's supposed to be like a book, like hundreds of pages. And so I did mine on how group structure affects cooperation. And it was based on this guy. I don't know if you've heard of this Colombian professor from the University of Columbia, because sometimes that can be confusing if you say Colombian professor. But his name was Duncan Watts, and he basically founded what became network sociology. And I was in college right around the time that like Facebook was starting to get big. It was only kind of in a certain number of colleges, and but so you could see the potential with that. And I was just like, whoa, like what could they do with that? But Duncan Watts, he came up with these amazing, really interesting studies. So he did one where he had a group, he had online rooms and or like online websites, and they had music, and it was all the same music, but in different like versions. They had like 100 people assigned to each like website. And in the different websites, he had a control version where they didn't have any ratings or comments, but in the other ones, they all had like a 0 to 5 star rating, and they had a number of view count, and they had some other things, right? And then so they had a rank. And what he found was, regardless, you would think that okay, you have 100 people, they go on, they get to listen to these songs and rank them. They're roughly going to all like the same songs, right? Like they tried to control for interests and stuff like that. What they actually found was any of the songs that were rated highly just got more high ratings.
Yep.
Right. And so not surprising, right? It's like it's the same thing that they would do on Reddit, where they just get a bunch of bots to like something and try to like shoot it out to the front page, because you kind of have that Pareto distribution that you gain momentum. People, if they see some sort of heuristic for validation. But he did a lot of those studies, right? You're talking about like group structures. And so my thesis was on, I actually used World of Warcraft as like a real world structure to study. And I looked at like gear score and achievement level as a way to kind of measure success. And then I looked at like guild hierarchy distributions as a way to understand structure. And then like I correlated those, and I there's some really interesting findings. That was a lot of fun.
That's interesting. If I could just add to that momentarily, sure. We covered this fascinating book called The Square and the Tower a few episodes ago, and it deals with network theory. And for those who don't know what that is, this is part of a much larger talk we could even have now if you'd like, but it's about it was graphing communities and human distributions on a graph with nodes, right? And if he was applying this to like intellectual revolutions or intellectual movements and then revolutions, seeing how the human groupings actually were. Like if you look at the Enlightenment, people would think it's this vast network of intellectuals. It's not really. And they could tell this from letters and things like that. The intellectual movements were geographically locked, and they were only connected through a few specific individuals. So if you look at that as if it's on a graph, you have all these nodes clustered, but they're these super nodes, and these super nodes are individuals with lots of connections, and they are the ones that tend to make these movements happen. And one example he gave in the book was, if you look at the American Revolution, the American Revolution is a fascinating phenomenon because it's all these different groups and militias and movements that oftentimes don't really talk to each other, and was up for individuals like Paul Revere. Paul Revere was a supernode. Paul Revere was the guy who knew everybody. So, and he was getting people connected. So you have these specific connectors that try and facilitate all this. But that's almost a Pareto distribution as well, because, to those who have the most connections, more connections are drawn, because, and then you could even say it in a simpler way, people like success. Why is Taylor Swift the Time Person of the Year? First of all, like, Taylor Swift's been around for a while. Taylor Swift has been climbing that ladder for a long time, but it is exponential. And at a certain point, those people we said who can't rotate shapes in their heads, that's what they're attracted to. They're attracted to the new big thing. They want to be a part of it. They want to be a part of the cool new thing that's happening. And so that's how someone like Taylor Swift, or Beyonce prior to that, she's just aged out into like a weird sort of thing, but that they're the crest of that wave that attracts people. And just like a popular person, once they reach a certain threshold, they just start bringing more and more people towards them. And some people say that's unfair. Well, it doesn't really fucking matter, because I fucking love science, whatever. But it's just a fact of life, and that's if you look at sort of decentralized movements that way, it's less of a rigid hierarchy and more of an ecosystem. And you can kind of, if it's a more modern one, you can track the communications through time. Even with like the Bolshevik Revolution would be one. You can track like the rise of the NSDAP. Any fucking revolution you can actually track this way. That was a bit of a tangent, but this is where I'm at intellectually right now. That's the stuff I'm interested in, is these decentralized networks, how these groups cluster, how connections can be made, and how these separate groups can accomplish something like the American Revolution. They can get this kind of general momentum, even though they might disagree on certain specifics, but as long as they have these supernodes that can kind of create this web, that's what makes things happen.
No, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. It's interesting because Duncan Watts' whole philosophy was, if you understood like the attributes of a network, you could understand how information moves through it. He wasn't really big on individual nodes being important. He looked more kind of broadly and uniformly. And I think that's kind of where a lot of his stuff fell flat, is because he didn't have like real world studies. A lot of his stuff was, he did some small real world studies, but a lot of the stuff that he did was online modeling of networks. And it was interesting because at the time, it was like Malcolm Gladwell came out with a book called The Tipping Point, and like the whole very small fledgling network sociology community was very mad at Malcolm Gladwell, because he talked about I think he had like 4 types of people that kind of have big influences in networks, and he talks about like the super connector and some other stuff, and they're like, no, this is so antithetical to all of the research that we've done, blah 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 blah. And I used to be very much on the network sociologist side of like, Malcolm Gladwell's kind of an idiot. And the more I've kind of lived and experienced, I agree with you 100% on this Pareto distribution idea, right? And I think we're kind of at this stage where, and we've talked a little bit about these ideas, so I'm going to kind of bring them together, is it takes a little bit of courage and tenacity and drive to try to establish yourself in the anon space, to go out there, to say these things, to create content. You're not really making any money, right? So it's kind of like a quote unquote like thankless job, so to speak. I mean, I think I love being a part of the network, and I think people are super friendly and supportive. But you're doing this because you believe in it, right? That's kind of the filter. And we're all coming here. We're coming to the space. We're starting to talk to each other. And I think, one of the ways that you determine the quality of someone, typically when it comes to like intelligence and drive and wisdom and all of these things, it's how articulate can they be, how well can they distill ideas and play around with ideas, right? Like I think of wrote a thread on like you can have like different levels of ideas. You can have your one-dimensional version of an idea that's just the representation, right? You think of that as a line of thought, you start and end. Then you have your two-dimensional representation of idea that's like a perspective, right? But it's limited, right? You're only looking at it from one way. Then you have the three-dimensional version of the idea, which is, you know, seeing it from different perspectives, but it's all about how all the different pieces fit together and create like a more cohesive structure. And then a four-dimensional, you know, informational space that's kind of just raw informational space. And so you can usually tell if someone exists on like a first, second, third, or fourth dimensional level of understanding of these ideas by how well they can play with it, right? The Feynman idea of the better you can explain something, the better you understand it.
I really like that. Just to pause there. I really like that explanation. I have nothing else to add other than I like that. Sorry, continue.
Well, and this is the other cool thing. I wrote a thread about how do you understand ideas, right? And I liken it to music, where, you know, if I have, you know, like Beethoven used to be able to conceptualize entire symphonies in his head, but if you're trying to talk to Beethoven and get him to explain that symphony, it'd be literally impossible, right? Like he could talk about it, he might explain some stuff, he could hum melody lines, but he's not going to be able to convey the full fidelity of that idea that's bumping around in his head. But if you've already heard that song, right, a simple reference is enough to kind of elicit a pretty articulate picture. And so I think that's what happens with a lot of Anons when you're saying like, oh, I thought I was the only one, right? It's that Spider-Man meme when he meets Miles Morales and he's like, you're just like me, right? Like the Spidey Sense single. Like that's when I meet like Anons. Like when I first met with Lucas, literally talked for 7 hours. When I first got on a call with Stormy, we literally talked for 7 hours. And it's because you're kind of like I found this weird person that also likes this weird esoteric band that, you know, they know all of these songs that I know, but like nobody else seems to know. And like you just jam about like all of your favorite songs, all your favorite ideas, how they connect. Like some people have pieces that you don't have. You get to put those together. Like that's, I think, the kind of space that we're in currently. Is and that's when I say we're gathering the Primarchs. We're gathering all of these people that care, that have the intellectual capability to like work in those higher dimensional spaces. They're forming the ideas in the pioneering level. And then the next step, is kind of the marketing side of things, is like, how do we distribute that broadly? How do we speak to the different generations? How do we get people, you know, how do we build the parallel movement from like a startup perspective, like, you know, minimal viable product and all that kind of stuff. And so I think that's where we're at, we're at this like formulation stage of the network.
Yeah. And you raised a good point there about how, you know, the reason I'm here and the reason I'm doing this is because I wouldn't be doing anything else. I can't imagine I'd be anywhere else, because I've been me for as long as I can remember. If you have any sort of self-awareness, that tends to come with age. You start to see the patterns of your own life. If you look back, like I couldn't have ended up anywhere else. What am I going to be? A fucking neocon? No. And you have to like people. It helps if you like people. There's a lot of people on your side that are here because they hate people. And that's the only reason, and they will just be directed by that hate, and they'll usually direct it at their friends eventually. They're directed to their own compatriots. But I think a lot of people, myself, like I'm here because I believe these ideas and I want to help people, and I do it for free. I make a little bit of money doing this, not a lot.
Sure.
I was doing it for free forever. And because I feel like I'm possessed by that passion, because I'm at a point where I'm fully confident in my first principles. And we were kind of talking about this earlier about people who are maybe shopping around for models. I would say they're shopping around for fandoms. A lot of people, men especially, they're looking for the model of masculinity, and they kind of go down these blind alleys and end up with a bunch of clowns and sickos. But, you know, a lot of times, like when you're trying to craft your life, are you just trying to craft a fandom, you know, just a model that you're trying to emulate, or do you actually have values and first principles or some deeper animating essence, and that it doesn't matter if you're the only one doing it, you actually just believe in it? And that's where I'm at now, where I'm not trying to model my life after anyone else. And I think once you reach that, and maybe it comes with age. I think you can be in your 20s and do that, but it took me a while to do it. You know, we didn't have this shit when I was younger. Like they didn't have like
I'm the same age group as you, so
yeah. Like if I was like 23 and we had this thing going on now, it might have been very different. But forums and like IRC chats were a lot different back then. It was just full of weirdos. But you know, anyway. I agree with what you're saying, and I think we're getting to a point where we're separating the people who are genuinely who are doing this because they actually want to help people and they care about people and they have a positive view and they have a confidence of values and first principles and not just like a utopian schematic that they're bickering over. And that sometimes has to emerge from an individual. That's where the spirituality comes from. You don't join a religion just because you want to join a collective. That's the bad way to go around about it. That's why people like kind of bounce between churches. You see that happen all the time because I haven't found the army to take me in yet, but you're going about it the wrong way. There is something generated within you as an individual, and I think we can sort rank for those people a bit better now.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I've tweeted about recently, because I have another article that's kind of bumping around in my head. It's called the game of life, or I think I initially called it the duality game because I was trying to articulate the idea between material and spiritual, but it doesn't quite make sense.
I realize that the game of life is also a game.
Yes, exactly. Well, and I don't know if you've read. I have a lot of content, so I wasn't. You're like I haven't read any, like, I've listened to like 2 podcasts that you're on, so I'm not like, oh, you haven't read my article on materialism or naturalism or whatever. But
I will say, I forgot to say this. I do like your site because I was reading your site and I am a huge fan. And I would just, as a point, say that I'd like to see more of stuff like this from people. It's very well made, and I think there's more public facing stuff that I like to see come from our side. Anyway, continue.
Hey, from a marketer, I'll take it, because the one thing that I'll hear from people is like, this is a little too gamery or something like that, and it's like, I think I know my audience, but I appreciate that if you're like an intellectual. It came from a guy who has like 3 PhDs. I was like, I think you have a certain different taste, but
yeah, how about 3 PhDs and no pussy?
Poor guy. I hope he's not listening to this. But so in naturalism, one of the things I talk about is we live in a world where you have rules, right? I believe in objective truth, right? Like foundationally, there is a truth. It's like the Kantian idea of truth. Like we never really know it, but it exists. And so that's our foundational belief for science, right? That is literally, science is founded on faith. Right. That's something that kind of gets lost on a lot of people these days. But then the other piece is, okay, well, if you have rules, what's the next step? It's a goal, right? And that's why when I say the goal of life is to flourish, right? And I think that's pretty self-explanatory. It's like life is that's not continuing, that's not perpetuating in healthy patterns, stops to existing, right? It's just dead, right? And so it makes sense to say flourishing is the best thing. Now, there's different ways you can do that, right? You obviously want to continue yourself if you think of yourself as a healthy pattern, but you also want to have kids and put out good ideas and do all that kind of stuff. But anytime you have rules and then a clear goal, you have strategies, optimal strategies. And so this is a big thing for me. It's like, I think we can say, I know that we can say being fat is bad. Like, period, objectively, it's not a question. Like, their beauty is good, right? Like, truth is good, right? Like, these things aren't, like, in my mind, like that whole nihilistic, subjective, there's no meaning on any of that kind of stuff. It's like, no, there's a game. It's got rules. It's got a goal. It's got strategies. If you don't know that, if you haven't figured that out yet, like, you need to get on that page, right? Where was I going
There's a
with
couple
this?
interesting. Let me just add to that, if you don't mind. I agree, and if I had to use my own words to describe it, we came to the conclusion through many reviews on the show and finding the same sort of arguments and patterns across different fields of study. I think it's fair to say that the meaning of life, the purpose of life, is replication, and that's a very scientific way of saying it. But a couple examples. I'll contrast 2 books here. There was a couple interesting books. One's called The Information. The other one was called Cybernetics by, was it Alfred Herbert Weiner, the guy who basically invented the word cybernetics. And you'll find this interesting. So, getting into data and getting into machine learning and like, what is information? What actually is information? Information is a very, very deep concept. Information, and in the book, The Information, it's a very interesting book. It's like, in short, I don't want to get too deep into this, but information is, it's like almost like a thought that is encoded with enough detail to withstand entropy. And we live in an entropic universe, and information is always trying to find ways to almost build armor around itself so it doesn't fall victim to entropy. And DNA is also information. Once you drill down into what DNA actually is, it's actually just information. And an argument made by a lot of geneticists is that, you know, the human body is just an information transmission system for DNA. It's just that something DNA created to exist in the universe to propagate itself going forward. And that's, so we're just a DNA delivery system. And we also reviewed the book, The Revolutionary Phenotype by J.F. Garepi. You know, some people have their thoughts on him, but it's a very, very interesting book. I can't recommend The Revolutionary Phenotype enough. But then I would contrast that against another book. And we had this gentleman on our show, E. Michael Jones. He had this book called Logos Rising. And he's a Catholic, and he approaches the concept of Logos. Logos, from a Christian Catholic perspective, all throughout history. What is Logos? And it goes into, you know, in the Bible, I'm not trying to give a Bible study here, but it was the phrase, in the beginning, there was the Word, and the Word was with God. And what the fuck does that mean? That's kind of a confusing idea. Like, and a lot of people just don't think about it. And he kind of went back in history and found the concept of logos, which is a Greek word, which is a pre-Christian idea, which was, you know, the act of speech which gives creation. So basically the idea of that there's God, but then there's this creative essence called logos, the word that is, he speaks it, but it's also this other thing that speaks through him. So like there's this essence of creation through love. And so when people say, oh, God's love, you know, I'm not trying to like convert people here, but just to explain where he's coming from. Like when you talk about creation through love is just the act of creation for the sake of creation. So almost within these two books, within these parallel models, you have almost the same thing of just replication for the sake of replication. And what you were talking about is sort of what is the replication? What's that vitalism? Like what makes it easier? Like what is healthy? Healthy things replicate, unhealthy things die. So we can say that which helps you replicate the most effectively is the healthiest, and that is also attuned to beauty. And so you start to see this start to gain traction about how you, like, why is it better to be fit than to be fat? Why is it better to reproduce than not reproduce? You know, and so it's all kind of bound up in that. I know that was a lot of ideas at once, but it was from a scientific perspective and even a religious perspective. You have the idea of replication for the sake of replication and figuring out and that's why the Catholics are so big into saying yes to life. That's why they're so anti-contraception. That's why they want to have a lot of kids. That's just a manifestation of that idea of just have as much life as possible for the sake of it, just because you like creation. Anyway, what do you think about all that?
Oh, I agree with you. I think, you know, the important thing in my mind is replication is not just have kids, it's replication of positive ideas, right? Like, I think that is kind of an important aspect as I've been thinking about it. It's like, that's why I think when I say flourishing and the propagation of healthy patterns, you yourself are a healthy pattern. You want to perpetuate that through time. You want to propagate that through time, right? You want to certainly... And
the belief is that if you have these qualities, you will propagate, and those, we might call them dysgenic qualities. Like if we want to use scary words, there's dysgenic qualities that are self-defeating. That, you know, there's this great tweet by this guy named Ian Miles Chong, I believe. You might have seen this one.
Oh no!
You
said a great tweet from Ian Miles Chong.
Great, right? I mean,
we were doing so well.
No, great, it's the worst thing you've ever seen, but could have only come from him, right? Because he's arguing for weakness.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, no, he just great as in he's a character. That everything he says, like he's such a fucking lummox, right? He's saying that he's like, I'm on the side of weakness. I'm on the side of because weakness outnumbers the strong. And I'm like, but you're fat and you're ugly and you're fucked up and you can't tie your shoes. And I don't think you reproduce. I don't think someone like you there's not going to be 7 Ian Miles Chongs. You can't. He's a dead end. And there's a lot of genetic dead ends, but you know, those people are kind of self-defeating if you leave them but they're like a giant dysgenic biomass that if you're not careful will rise up and swallow you too. But if you are attuned to these sort of vitalistic ideas that you're talking about, like it seems that you're destined to reproduce just because you're aligned with beauty, with truth, with duty, with legacy. legacy. You care about legacy. These people don't. So they're bound to just die in a fucking ditch somewhere.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Right. I think that is a big thing for me. Is like you want to put these healthy things into the world, and there is things that are better, right? Like you should be pursuing and perpetuating and promoting things that are better. And I also think, I mentioned that I'm God pilled. So basically, and if you've ever read Huxley's The Perennial Philosophy, but that's like the most kind of known work that kind of aligns with my own. I call it meta spirituality, which is I believe all religions are different interpretations of the same thing. Call it God, a higher power, whatever you'd like. I call it the divine. I think that there are certainly better interpretations than others, right? You think of like, similarly, like I think there are better cultures than others. I think there are better people than others, right? Like that, you shouldn't be a crazy idea. And I think Christianity is clearly, the superior religion. That being said, I think it's like any framework, it is limiting in the sense that if you like, I've run into people who think sola scriptura, right? It's like, I can't believe anything that's not in the Bible. And to me, I found God through life, through experience. Like I had a divine revelation where I spoke with God and I kind of tapped into the code. That's my experience and my interpretation. And, I think anyone's capable of that if they kind of humble themselves and do the right thing. And so I think that there's alternative paths outside the Bible to learning. You don't need...
Absolutely. If I can interrupt for a second, just to clarify, I'm very much with you there. And I'll give an example of what I don't want to do, because there's a lot of Christians and a lot of people who say this, who I deeply respect, but they get so deep into Christianity that they say that, well, due to God's providence, we essentially deserve everything we're getting. That they say good wins in the end. God wins in the end. So it actually doesn't matter what we're going through right now, because I have faith that good triumphs in the end. And I'm like, I don't know what to do with that. I don't know how that addresses any of these problems. I'm not going to just lay down. That's sort of the Tolstoy thing we're talking about. Like, you believe that good wins in the end, so I'm going to let evil trample me due to that faith. I'm like, that there's no utility in that. I think that's defeating. And there's a lot of Christians who would say that's not a Christian belief, but there's a lot of people who think that. And I think that does not have any political influence. Like, you still need to be on the side of survival. And if anything conflicts with the drive for survival, for replication, reproduction, creation, whatever, that should be put to the side. Like, don't be so ideological or spiritual that it becomes anesthetizing, I guess is what I would get at.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's well encapsulated in the idea that like God helps those who help themselves. Right. It's like, yes, I believe that truth is superior, that good is superior, but that doesn't mean I'm just going to wait for that to happen. Right. And I think we talked a little bit about this earlier. It's like, we need people who are willing to take up the sword. That was my whole thing, is like, look, I don't think I'm the best guy out there, right? There might be better people than me, but like, I see that there's this opportunity to build something, to be the guy to, start networking people together, having conversations, pushing it in the direction that I think it should go. Even if no one else is going to do that, I'm going to go and do that. And I could be wrong, right? And I could fail miserably and all that kind of stuff. But I know that my time on earth is precious. I know that I'm like, and I would not forgive myself if I saw this as a need and I just stood idly by.
Yeah. Well, one thing that, a public policy that I would advocate for here in Canada, which is a hard stop on the influx of immigration and probably mass deportations of a lot of the Indians who've come in over the past 10 years, because it's gone insane. And they would say, well, that's not very Christ-like. And I would say, I'll take it up with him. In the meantime, go fuck yourself. You're not using that against me. I was born on night. I wasn't fucking born last night. That ain't going to work on me. Well, you know what Christ would do? Whatever I say. But I don't believe in any of that shit. Go fuck yourself. I'll kick you in the knees. Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing, right? There's this interesting tweet. I'm sure you know of Destiny, the guy who got divorced recently out of his open relationship.
Oh yeah. I tell you what, I don't even hate Destiny. I've actually watched enough Destiny clips where I'm like, you know what? I bet I could talk to this guy, and maybe we could even come to terms on some things.
He's a bit of a sophist.
He's a weird guy. When he decides he wants to be against you, he'll get his community to come up with the points. Like, he just wants to beat Alex Jones, but he's also willing to go on Jesse Lee Peterson and be called a cuck for an hour. I'm like, okay, that's kind of funny. Like, he's willing. I don't know. I think I could work on him. I don't know.
Okay.
Anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, like I haven't consumed a lot of his content.
He's going through his divorce arc. He might end up hating women at the end of this.
Yeah. It might be a very interesting journey that he slowly like red pills, and then maybe he just drags a shit ton of his followers along with him. But to me, he's an egregore of like a lot of these sophist kind of life is subjective arguments.
Oh, exactly. Like, I don't agree with any of that stuff. Let me just be clear on that.
No, and I get that's what you're saying. He's like, he's at least curious and willing to have the conversations. But I saw this clip, and he's discussing this with a Christian, and he makes the point like, well, look, you have this one guy who says, oh, my morality is based on God. And you have this other person who says that their morality is based on the word of God, but they disagree about what is moral and what is correct. So how do you justify that? Right. And the guy's like kind of stumbling over himself, and he doesn't really have a good answer to that question. And I'm like, dude, I would destroy you if I got to answer that question. And my answer is basically goes back to that naturalist thing where, look, there's rules to reality. And we might not know them perfectly, but we can build frameworks based on our experience, right? Like, that's the process, is we're building a framework for understanding reality. And then there is a goal, right? That goal of flourishing. But it's always contextual. You're playing the meta game, of course, right? Where you need to make a decision inside, what resources do I have? What is the situation I'm in? And how do I optimize between the two? And so morality is more of like, you can have these general strategies, but it's ever shifting based on the context. And so this is the problem, is like, for guys like us, where we can look at a situation and we can make decisions, we don't need, like, we can follow general rules, but then there's a group of people that just need rules so that they can just go back and default to those things, but they're not going to be able to think creatively or, kind of inventively in the moment. Right. And I think that that's the problem with morality, is people like that, they look and they say, it's always good to be kind. Right. They just have this rule, but they don't understand. Okay, well, like, if someone is invading your house and they're going to kill your family, like, do you not think it's okay to kill that person in self-defense? Like, I do. Like, no question.
An interesting manifestation of that in geopolitics is the neo-realist school of thought, which tries to stand outside of ideology, and it seeks. I wrote an article on this for the website I have called the Vanguardist Journal. That's where I write all of my long form stuff. And the Prudentialist is big on this. Prudentialist. He's huge in the school of thought. This would be Hans Morgenthau. This would be John Mearsheimer. There's a lot of advocates of this. Those names might sound familiar to people who are into this stuff. But it's trying to say that, a lot of the values and ideology, for example, like, America talks about freedom, but it doesn't behave often in a way where it's promoting freedom. And it might align with people who don't go, who are against freedom entirely. Because at the end of the day, the purpose of every leader of a nation is just to secure the existence of that nation. And oftentimes they'll bend the rules circumstantially. And you'll work with some, like, why did the Americans work with the communists against the Nazis and then work with others against the communists later? Because, these sliding sort of relationships are it's game theory, essentially. It's that, I'm going to bend the rules because nothing will supersede my desire for the survival of my people and my nation, however that might be. So at the highest level of public policy, you have people making these shady deals, because once you realize that survival is the only thing that matters, these sort of highfalutin ideas of morality, you can talk about them, and you could even have religious values that you kind of push to the side. Saudi Arabia China doesn't like America, but China has a lot of dealings with America that are, and this is also what Marco Popic was talking about. He said, idealism is always subservient to constraints, to material constraints. And this gets into like a whole other geopolitical theory, but there's certain realities that all the ideology and all the morality can't get you over, and you just need to confront them if you want to survive. And if you believe that my survival long term is the only thing that matters, your morality is actually subservient to that in most cases. So you might end up having to betray your ideals one day, but you fucking need to. Like but just saying like, I'm always anti-murder, I'm anti-violence, so you're not going to defend yourself. Okay, then you die. Like then you're gone. Like there's certain times where you'll need to betray your ideals just because the circumstance demands.
This is a big point for me. So when I was writing that game about, balancing the material and the spiritual, right? Like it's so easy for people nowadays to say, "Oh, I'll make a material sacrifice for my spiritual ideals," right? Like I will turn the other cheek because I think it's right to be kind, and I'll take the downside of that. People rarely think about the situations in where they should compromise their spiritual ideals for their material. Now, I'm not saying this is something that people should just do and do wantonly, but the reason that we have the material is that it enables us to better pursue the spiritual. This is a big thing. Like I believe that God created the universe very intentionally. It is perfect. There is literally no better way that it could be constructed. And the reason, one of the core parts of this perfect system is if you have a belief, and you can talk about that belief, you can say things, right? That doesn't matter. What matters is your actions. Does your actions reflect those beliefs? And you can't prove that you believe something without actually taking action. I have a good friend on the timeline. He's a bodybuilder, and he had put something about how, there's a lot of right-wing guys, in the gym, and there's a lot of good people in the gym. And why is that? It's like, we're good people and we're in the gym. And I basically wrote this thing and I said, look, it is objectively true that it is good to be healthy. And if you understand truth and you believe in truth, the only way that you can say that you really believe in it is if you're going to the gym and you're working out and you're getting healthy. Because if you say that you believe in that thing and then you don't really do it, what you believe in is seeming like you believe in that thing. You think that it's valuable to seem like you're doing those things, right? And so real belief is tested by the actions that you take in your life. Your life story is literally a manifestation of your soul, of the degree of belief that you have and the will that you have to act it. And I forget exactly where my point was.
That's a good point. Just to circle back to destiny, yeah. I do find that people on the right, they put their money where their mouth is. And I see that more than anywhere else politically. And, someone like Destiny, just to be a bit mean here, like I bet I've seen him talk all day about, raising kids and stuff, but he abandoned his child. He didn't raise his son. He left the single mother to raise it and sends them money. But he talks a lot of these sort of high-minded ideas. But if you look at the life he is living, he just streams 24/7 and lives a hedonistic lifestyle. Yeah. And so hearing any sort of high-minded idea come out of that manifestation of it just rings false. And you can't just live a false life like that forever. Eventually you do need to turn it on yourself. Like, I'm in favor of masculinity. Okay, but are you taking steps to live in a masculine space? That's hard. I know it's hard. One of my favorite quotes is from Harvey Pekar, American Splendor. Real life, they said, all you do is write about real life. And he said, hey man, real life's pretty complicated stuff. It is. And this is the thing about, if you're living your life well, if you are trying to be in shape, learn how to shoot guns and raise a family, it's hard to find time for anything else. I don't know how I find time to podcast with a fucking 9-month-old up here. but if you're living life, manifesting all these beliefs, it's going to be really difficult, but you'll feel like you're on a trajectory, and the feeling like you're on some kind of path is more energizing than just living in the theory of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's as simple as, I'm sure, have you ever heard of like flow state or being in the zone, right? Like you heard of being in the zone. Yeah. So I read this really great book. It's called The Rise of Superman. It's not about, cartoons or anything like that, or comics, but it's about how extreme sports, studying extreme sports as a pathway to understanding that kind of like flow state that you can achieve, right? Because you can achieve flow state in a conversation or whatever it is, but really what flow state is that point of engagement where you're not over challenged, but you're not under challenged, right? Like you're engaged in the moment with what you're doing. And why is it that your body, your mind, like it just feels good when you're engaged in the right level of challenge? Well, my theory on kind of a spiritual side of why we exist, why we're here, is we are here to come to know ourselves, to come to know God, and to come to know creation, the created world. And it is through the experience of our lives, through trial and adversity, where we come to know these things, right? Because in order to understand the world around us, we need to come to understand it. But you also need to come to understand ourselves. It's like, what resources do I have? How's the world around me react? How do I engage with that? And so, but you're also, as you engage with those different, problems and adversity and stuff like that, you are literally displaying the quality of your soul through your actions. And so again, I talked earlier about this perfect system and how this works, right? And so that's a big part of this, is like, you are literally, through your life story, through these challenges and adversity and all these difficult things that you're doing, you are displaying who you are. You're learning about the universe. You're learning about God. You're learning about yourself. And when I encourage people to think about their lives, right, and to think about what they should be doing with their lives, one of the things I do is say, take a step back. Think of your life like a story, like you're reading a book about yourself, and put yourself, like, tell your story up to where you are now, and think, what would you want that character to do? If they were to do something that you would admire and that you would appreciate and you would respect, what does that look like? And I think that is the way you should orient yourself, is you should always try to do the things where you can look at yourself in the mirror and you can say, hey, look, like, it wasn't an easy decision. It might not have been like the quote unquote, like, best or moral decision by those rigid standards, but I made the decision based on what I believed was the right thing to do. And so it is that engagement in the question. It's that thinking. I tell people all the time, they'll say, oh, how do I know if I'm a good person? I say, I already know you're a good person. They're like, wait, that's not possible. I make mistakes all the time. I'm like, yes, that's part of life. You're going to make mistakes. But the people who are the best people are the people who are thinking about, how do I know if I'm the best person? What am I doing? Like, are these things that I'm doing actually good? Right? Because that is the first step. It's not about knowing the answer. It's about engaging with the question, with the right questions.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned earlier, sorry to interrupt you, but
no,
there's a lot to go off of there. And you had mentioned, I think earlier, how you like to write, and even journaling and things like that. And that's sort of what that's manifestation of, like, taking your thoughts and putting them on page, confronting your ideas, which is something people don't do. Similarly, confronting your past. And like I said before, this stuff seems to come with age. But I think you can do it in your 20s. I certainly did to some degree, but taking a cold, hard look at you as if you were someone that even do that with your parents. Look at your mom or dad just as a woman or a guy that, look at them like their friends might look at them. It's kind of trippy once you do that, but look at them as people. Look at yourself as not just the main character of your life. Like, maybe you made bad decisions, but this comes easy for guys like us because we record our voices all the fuck time and are forced to listen to it again and again. It's a maddening experience, but I've had to be confronted with my own ideas constantly, and you become numb to it after a while, but you actually, there's a strength that comes with that of really looking at your life and realizing that the sequence of events, the chain that brought you to this point. And maybe some people can never do that. Like we said, some people got no internal monologue. Maybe it's not something everybody can do, but probably the people listening to this show can. Yeah. And I think that's a good starting point. And also, this also comes easy to people who've lived what we might describe as a well-textured life. The guys who've been divorced, the guys who have had addictions that they overcame, or depression that they overcame, some hardship that forces them to confront themselves like that. Like, I used to have a pretty bad drinking problem. I haven't had drink in many years. And, usually when you come out of some sort of substance abuse issue, you're in some kind of program or whatever, but you need to, like, why did I do this? And really unwork, because it's not just that I have a problem with this one thing. No, you got a much deeper problem in your software, that this is just one manifestation of that. Maybe you got a problem with going too far with everything. You can't control yourself with any substance. There's all kinds of things if you really look at yourself like a guy that So maybe that comes easier to people who've had maybe rough lives, maybe lives where things didn't always go right. And maybe there's a lot of those people in this scene. And again, this sounds like psychology stuff and people don't like that, but you'll be able to achieve a confidence that you'll understand your place in the world better. you'll understand why things happen. And that's at the very least a starting point to build yourself into who you want to be.
Yeah. And I love that we're on the same wavelength about this. Like I had a good feeling and I didn't think, Stormy would have recommended you lightly. But I think what we're really hitting on here to kind of like give it a nice, kind of like moniker, or just kind of give a name to it, is what we're really into in this space is a pursuit of truth. And with that pursuit of truth becomes a journey of self-discovery. Right. And what we're, that's why a lot of my content is focused on, self-improvement early on. Right. It's like you need to become a strong version of yourself for you to then go out and to make the world around you a better place. And so how do you do that? Well, it's a spiritual thing. It's a psychological thing. It's a, hard work. It's practical. It's learning the material ways of the world. Right. And I think that is why, you come to, the Anon space and Twitter and X, and you have the bodybuilder group, you have the food guys, you have the tech bros, you have the crypto people, right? You have the arts and the literature people, right? Like it's all of these groups are just saying like, learn, grow, improve. And now we're at that space. Okay, cool. Like now we have a lot of strong minds. We have a lot of amazingly brilliant people. You had made the point earlier, right? Like if you come to this space and everyone's kind of like a basement dwelling retard, then you're probably like, yeah, this is probably not the place for me. But you come here and you just run into these brilliant minds, these people who have built amazing things, or they're really fascinating, or they're passionate about stuff. And you're like, oh, this feels like I'm in the right place.
Or you know what's interesting is some people come at it from maybe most people come at it from the opposite direction. They come at it like, I'm just interested in bodybuilding. I'm just interested in weird old books, and then they pursue that, and then just miraculously find themselves surrounded by all these right-wing schizos. You know what I mean? Like they start with something like, I just have this interest in this very fascinating thing that leads them eventually into a political space. But that was the one thing the right always had in my mind. Going back to the bodybuilding forums, going back to anyone who was taking bodybuilding or fitness seriously, it started with that interest, and then the forums were just coincidentally filled up with right-wing guys. It just followed.
Yeah, no, I agree. And this is a nice thing. This is like a little transition that we can make, because I've gone to different like events with people that kind of cross over. They're just kind of like alternative spaces, like the Sovereign House events in New York. And I've run into people there who, I ran into this one guy who's very passionate about understanding the psychedelic space, right? The spiritual psychedelic space, mapping that out. And, we were having a conversation, and I was talking about how, kind of the space in Twitter that I occupy. And a lot of my point with how I try to position myself is I don't go super hard in the timeline. I don't typically go too hard in the podcast or anything like that, because to your point, I think there's a lot of people who are interested in pursuing truth. These are academics or they're bodybuilders or whatever it is, and they pursue that truth, and then they'll run into people who are like really spicy. And to your point earlier about, that propaganda, they just have this kind of response that's very, I can't be with these people. These people are like evil Nazis or whatever it is. And that kind of pushes away these truth seekers who would otherwise be very good to incorporate into the movement. And so a lot of what I try to do is kind of straddle that middle ground, where let me create palatable rebrandings of like our ideology or our philosophy. So naturalism is branded as we're pursuing truth, right? Left brain and right brain truth, right? Having that balance is where we actually want to be. So we can be more palatable to academics. We can be more palatable to the people in the space who would join us if they, weren't kind of confronted by these little bit more spicier parts of our space on X.
Yeah, or sort of antisocial humor that has its space, but maybe I don't want to give any names here, but I've got stories for days about guys, especially in Europe, who they're nationalists and they have their own little nationalist groups, and sometimes they would have a very serious speaker come to visit them and speak at a conference, and then this group full of the type of guy we're talking about just completely bomb. It's like you get like a serious academic and you're telling like Rick and Morty porn jokes, like just very abrasive humor. Like you don't know how to engage with this type of mind. And even when I look at guys like we talked before, Michael Jones, when I spoke to him, he's a serious guy. He's a very serious guy, and it's interesting seeing guys like him or others who just find themselves in the space. Like, they're very popular with meme people and 4chan people. And so, I was going to mention this. So during my interview, I got a question from one of our listeners just to say the word sneed. You know what sneed is, right?
I'm not familiar with that term, but I'm not going to ask you to define it on the podcast.
Okay, look up. But that's the thing. Like, he said, sneed is like, well, what's sneed? What is that? And he got his assistant. He's like, who's listening in? He's like, look up sneed. And it was just like the fact that a man who's published 900 books and has had such a storied academic career, he's sitting with a little chunk of coal like me, saying, oh, have you heard about sneed? Like, fuck me, right? But the fact is that a lot of these guys are in this space surrounded by people like us, and I don't want to make them feel like they made a mistake, and I think and this is something we talk about a lot, and there's a debate going on about whether we should like hide our true feelings or stuff. But I always come back to a lot of a policy that we have on the show, and something I've said before is I don't discuss anything on the show, as kooky and extreme as it may be, that I wouldn't discuss with my friends or family, and I often have. And also, even though I am anonymous, I assume one day we will be doxxed. I assume one day I will have my face and name tied to these sound bites, and I stand by everything I said. And I say it assuming that I'll be doxxed. Like, is this the best way? If this was played in court, is this the best terminology I could be using? Sometimes maybe we go a bit overboard, but I have cut stuff out of the show before. But I always keep that in mind. Like, is this, and something for my audience? Our show is a very varied and diverse audience, but that might not be the way I would explain it even to you right now, or to, I always say, this goes back to what you had said before about the ability to explain ideas. I say, if I can explain this idea to my mom, then I understand it. And that's not a mark against my mom, but if anyone can speak about their ideas to their parents without going off on some schizo sounding, aggressive, abrasive rant, then I think you understand it. And this kind of cuts to the core of what I think we were going to talk about. Just, I do actually need to get going soon, however.
Yeah, I was just about to say, I mean, I could go for multiple hours, but you also have a family and probably
I will get going soon. but this, there's a through line of this episode, which is that tailoring the message to different audiences. And this isn't necessarily just a marketing guy sort of thing, but I do approach it like that not every idea works for all audiences, all listeners, but I'm convinced we can take even the more extreme ideas on our side and craft them so that my mom, your mom, or whatever academic can hear them from a podium and say, that's a good idea. I've never heard it explained like that before. And I would encourage people on our side, like, don't get oversold. We call ourselves like schizos, but you're not. These are realistic. Sure. These are essential ideas. Remember, we use words like vitalism. We use all these other words, but the ideas we're talking about are essential. We think they're true. We're so convinced that they're true that we're willing to live on the margins because of it. People lose their jobs. They don't talk to their fucking families anymore because they wanted to stand on the side of truth, right? So that, like, realize that that's important. Anyway.
Sure. No,
and realize that if you believe that's true, you can express that to other people. It doesn't always need to be ugly. Sometimes it should be. Sometimes it's funny. I'm not saying don't tell jokes. Like, I'm a shit post. I come from a shit posters pathway. So for me, the idea of engaging with Twitter in any way that wasn't just insane and making people upset was completely foreign to me. I've changed since then. I actually take Twitter a bit more seriously now, but I spent years getting banned from Twitter just because I liked making people mad. But that kind of went away. You know what I mean? I'm like that old internet sort of guy where I'm like, I thought we were just using this for trolling, but now I've changed a bit. And there's ways to engage in this to make yourself not just troll. I'm evidence of that.
Yeah, no, and to kind of, as we're starting to wrap up here, to kind of jump off what you're saying, This was actually something that you had brought up in one of the podcasts that I was listening to of yours earlier. And you said, I don't really like the idea of stuffing each generation into a certain box. And I actually wanted to bring up a little bit of a counterpoint, which I think you probably understand this nuance, but I think it'd be fun to kind of articulate here, which is, I think that the reason that memes are so powerful is you're basically leveraging, like if I make an analogy when I explain something, right? I explained, conveying ideas, the difficulty of communication by way of a musical analogy, right? It's like, I can't convey a song in all of its complexity just by talking about it. And so that elicits a very clear picture. You understand, oh yeah, it is like really hard to do that. I think of memes and other things like that. They're like cultural analogies, right? It's like, oh, we both, watch the Marvel movies. So if I throw up a Marvel meme, like, one of the older, better ones, right? You'll get it, right? Or at least it bumped around on the internet that most people already kind of know what it means. And so you can like kind of overlay your own meaning on top of that analogy, and it conveys those ideas very effectively, very efficiently. And I think similarly, each generation kind of lived through certain memes, right? Certain cultural memes. And so when you're communicating to them, you kind of have to leverage that knowledge level, right? That shared experience that they have. And so I agree that like we don't want to overbox certain generations, but also understanding like we can leverage that generation's shared experiences to better communicate. And so I think this is a good kind of question to kind of throw your way as we're looking to wrap up here is, how do you see us, how do you see this going? Because I think Stormy, I had said, hey, what questions should I ask Dimes as we have this podcast? And he was kind of like KPIs on progress and success of the movement. And I obviously think, communication of these ideas is one of the core ways to do that. And so if you just give a little bit of illustration to kind of how you see the movement going from here, how do you see communicating with these different generations and finding that success?
There's a lot to go on there. So I don't want to bury the lead on this with the KPI thing. This goes back to sort of the short-term missions we were talking about. Setting the KPIs. I got one, and a good friend of mine by the name of Paul Fahrenheit, who, if you don't know him, you'd probably like talking to him. He's with that old Glory Club, if you've ever heard of that. But I had made a comment that he was trying to test, where I said a group of 5 people could take down any NGO, a non-government organization. And by take down, I don't mean in any terroristic way. I mean take it down the same way our careers or our organizations get taken down by email campaigns and whatnot. And the reason I said this is because in my career, I'd spent some time working with NGOs, and I could see NGOs from the inside, and I saw how they operated. I saw how weak they were and confused they were, how little data oftentimes they were working on, that they're not these impenetrable organizations, that 5 driven individuals could start a campaign to get their funding cut, ruin their image, send emails, send phone calls, turn journalists against them, do what Antifa does to all these anti-hate organizations do against us. So I would say that's a KPI. Prove me wrong. Let's get 5 guys together. Let's, what's happening, like, with Keith Woods, I don't know what your feelings on him are, but this campaign against the ADL, people will say, well, does that solve the entire problem? No, that solves this one mission. The mission here is take down the ADL. That's a measurable mission. And if he succeeds, he either succeeds or he fails, or him. And it's not just him, obviously, but that's a measurable mission. And then we can replicate that across time. How many people did it take to do that? How long did it take to do that? The one example that Paul Fahrenheit was bringing to the table was, it was some kind of, a statue that was taken down at his school, and they were trying to figure out if they could fight that. Anyway, there's
it's the Robert E. Lee statue, or was it was his horse, right?
I think it was his horse or his
they were destroyed the gravestone. I was actually in that space when they were talking about that. Real quick, I just wanted to throw out there, same thing with Rufo and taking down the Harvard president. I think a lot of people are looking at that the wrong way. They're saying, oh, this isn't enough, this isn't really going to move the needle. It's like, this is a huge milestone, right? This is very impressive, and this is good work, and we should, instead of like looking at all the ways that we it could have been better or didn't go exactly as planned, like, you should just be happy, celebrate, and kind of try to replicate it.
in startup language, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of minimum viable product.
Yep.
It's for people, the folks at home who don't know, it's very easy for startup founders to create this big, humongous, complicated company when in fact they need the most stripped down version of that company to test it, to test your assumptions. The story there was that Twitter originally was this huge bloated platform that the 140 character status update was like 1% of it, and then over time that got hacked away until the one thing that that actually worked remained. Now what you want to do is invert that, find the most stripped down version of your idea and test your assumptions. And we do this with A/B testing and marketing as well. There's lots of different ways, but you need to test as quickly and with as much agility as possible. So the KPIs are built around that. What is a thing that you and 3 to 5 people can do within, let's say, 6 months? Let's set that as a time frame. It has to be realistic and it can't be cost intensive. Maybe it's just, and this is where we get to another issue, which is you got to find 5 guys that you could work with. And that's a different avenue entirely. That's a different discussion, but I think that's something we're also working on. I think it's more important. One problem that we get into on the right is we stand as individuals trying to join an ideology. What most guys need is a crew of 5 guys, 5 guys that they can do projects with. Maybe that's working out. Maybe that's going on hikes, whatever it might be. It could also bring down an NGO if you had enough. Now, the KPIs will obviously evolve and optimize, but I think 5 guys could set a goal of taking down a mid-sized NGO, not just anyone. You don't need to take down a fucking charity, but an NGO that is, pushing, migrants into Italy, something like that. Think of one. I bet you can think of a few, and these are not invincible. And I think that will be one KPI. And there was another question you had about generations. I might come back.
Yeah.
To
how do you market and how do you kind of convey these messages? Because I think, this is great. We're always theory selling, on the fringe and developing these new ideas. How do we spread these? How do we disseminate these more broadly?
Yeah. Let me just make sure that I'm clear on my point. What you were referring to was me speaking with my co-host, Judas. And I was saying that, the idea of segmenting and demarcating generations like boomers, Gen X, millennials seems to be a fairly recent phenomenon. It goes back to, I think, like the silent generation, and then it's just the jungles of time before that. And it seems like a modern thing where the boomers are this one identity. And I didn't like the way that we were bookending these generations as teams that were pitted against each other. I didn't like how millennials were always against boomers and like boomers were always against millennials, as if we weren't just links in the same chain. However, and my co-host correctly pushed back. He's like, well, the reason we need something right to demarcate that there are unique and distinct historical pressures that what is a boomer? Well, a boomer went through a very specific period of time of prosperity in America. Maybe that window of time is not viewable through other generations. So that means that they are distinct in a certain way. I understand that, obviously. I just don't like where we're like anti-boomer, we're as if they're a different race entirely. That's so I was from the position of how can these generations communicate? And I'll say this, I would say this to people because there is a time when they will say the same thing about millennials. And I don't want to be in the boomer position. And I gave people a couple ideas on how that'll happen. Yep. Here's one for you. Get ready for the day when Gen Alpha starts shitting on millennials because we turned the crypto space into a circus. We're going to be answering for that for a long time. Here's another thing that whether you think it's fair or not, whether we have all kinds of reasons why when we did crypto, it was insane and retarded and full of grifters. It's almost entirely grift right now. And they'll say, why the fuck did you guys do that? Just like we say to the boomers with real estate, right? Another thing they'll say about us that might not seem fair is that we didn't do COVID properly and that the millennials who had kids that came up in COVID, they didn't homeschool them properly when they need to. So now they're all developmentally delayed. So get ready for their developmental delayment to be blamed on you as a generation. That's what the boomers feel. So I'm trying to find some commonality. I see that coming. Is there a reason we need to have such animosity between generations? Because even now they're like, oh, boomers aren't the real bad guys. The real bad guys are Gen X. I want to exit that conversation entirely because it's about survival. Now, which
No,
isn't to say that there's not complaints about boomers, not to say that the boomers are perfect.
sure. And I like I think Stormy would appreciate that take. He always jokingly says he's radicalizing the boomer waffen. But yeah, like I agree. Like how do you kind of bring those teams together? You're already seeing with like Bill Ackman, right, who's now kind of been radicalized by the timeline around DEI stuff. And he's mobilizing his fortune to like go after like MIT and a bunch of these other like places.
Yeah.
It's crazy to see. And I think we are going to see more of these people, especially the wealthy people, because I think a lot of their kids got radicalized. There's a lot of wealthy people who have like kids who are now like trans and dealing with all of that, and like they're mortified and they're like, I need to push back against this. And so I think this is a big part of what I'm trying to do. And I mentioned with the academic earlier, seeking truth, is we need to create a space where we're accepting the converts, we're accepting the allies coming in, and especially as you're kind of talking about this across the generational lines.
Yeah, and also this comes back to that fundamental point of you have to like people. Do you hate? Do you just hate old people? Do you just hate? Is your heart full of hate? Is there a pathway for the boomer to admit that they were wrong? Is there a pathway for people to generally say, I was wrong about something, tell me more? Or are we always casting them aside? Maybe I'm naive. Maybe I'm just a big sweater boy cutie, big softy with a big heart. But I'm interested in finding new pathways of communication, especially for a generation that at present holds the vast majority of the capital. And I'm interested in a survival plan going forward. There was, just to make it real, just to distribute the black pills, there's stories breaking on Twitter right now from the inside of the airline industry, saying that a lot of the diversity hires there's a thin veneer of boomer competence keeping a thin membrane keeping this whole thing together. And once the boomers retire, this thing might, there's redundancies and systems in place, but there is a competency crisis. And maybe, my co-host made a good point. He said, if boomers aren't passing the torch, maybe we need to be a bit more proactive about grabbing the torch, not in a hateful or aggressive way, but this is also what Paul Fahrenheit and others I talk about, which is like, there are places where boomers are, and maybe they don't know how to pass the torch. Maybe they're waiting for young people to go into these lodges, go into these fraternal organizations and say, I'm here, there's things to do. And maybe we can complain that maybe the boomers aren't being proactive enough about passing the torch. I'll hear that case made. But however, it comes down to survival. I don't really give a shit anymore. I don't want the fucking airplanes falling out of the sky.
Yeah. Stop complaining that they're not handing you the torch. Like, if go find the solution, which is like take action yourself. This is a big thing. When I think of tech, I'm a big proponent of managing up. Right. A lot of times if there's a problem in tech, it's because the goal wasn't clearly defined. And yeah, you can put that at the feet of your manager, but also like you can do the work to say, okay, let's define this goal together. Like, I want to understand what you really want. Right. And you do that work. When I had the podcast with Stormy, we talked at long form about finance. It was like a 5-hour podcast. But one of the points that he makes near the end of the podcast is like, look, all these boomers, to your point, have a lot of money. They're generally pretty confident. They've built businesses. They have a lot of success. They're looking to pass that on. A lot of boomer kids or the kids of the boomers are not going to be interested in inheriting their parents' businesses, especially if they're like trades jobs or something like that. And so there's this huge opportunity for anons if they want, like go find a boomer that runs a business and talk to them about like their book of clients. And, if they're not passing that on to someone, that is a huge opportunity. And so I agree with this.
That sounds like to me, that sounds like a KPI. That sounds like the beginning of a firm where it said, let's get a lot of these guys together. Let's attack this problem in the short term. See if we can make a case for, a conglomerate to maybe take over these businesses. Say we represent the young generation. We're the young whippersnappers. There's a way to do this. The way I'm explaining it right now might sound reductive, but once you have this strategy, if we know where the money is over there. I've identified the problem. That is the birth of a strategy. That's the birth of a measurable strategy. And the thing about KPIs in this sense is they evolve and optimize as well. But you need to get started, and the more we talk about it, like you and me, like this, these conversations can be happening anywhere. I bet you can identify where the money is and how to get it. And it doesn't involve red pilling. It doesn't involve starting another podcast. By the way, no one's starting any podcast. There's enough. Just listen to Blood Satellite. Just listen to Meta Prime. I don't want to hear about any more podcasts coming out. Work with the ones you got.
Yeah, and that's a big thing too. If you're going to get involved in the parallel movement, I tell people like scout it out first, right? We want a biodiversity. I use biodiversity of strategy, but yeah, you know, instead of trying to create like a bunch of copies of the same strategy, let's try to augment the ones that we have. So as we're kind of driving towards the end here, you know, I wanted to give you a chance a little bit to kind of promote your content to listeners. I did check out your website that you have linked. That was really cool. I liked the video that you have on there. It's very like tongue in cheek. But you know, I assume if you've already talked about like KPIs before, it sounds like, and what to move forward. Yeah, like point people to some of the good content out there that they can find, and some of the platforms they can find you on.
Yeah, check out bloodsatellite.ca. That's the hub where you can find anything show related. If you remember one website, remember that. We also have a storefront called Good Suffer. That's goodsuffer.com. That's where we sell merchandise related to the show. We also have partnerships with a number of other creators in our space, including Jay Burden, the Sunflower Society, the Z-Man, the Restoration Bureau, which you might be familiar with. People have probably seen these designs out there, but you can buy prints, you can buy merchandise for a lot of these content creators we partnered with. They get 100% of the proceeds, 100% of the profits rather, after production. And then the Vanguardist Journal, if you like the show, if you listen to the show and you like it, the vanguardistjournal.com. That's where I publish long form pieces related to some of the topics that we talk about on the show that, like we discussed, are to treat them a bit more seriously, because Blood Satellite, it's a fun show. You'll love listening to it. It can be irreverent. It's very funny, very, you know, extreme in some places. We go off the handle on some topics, but the Vanguardist Journal is like, let's take these very big topics and put our best face forward. And so we spend a lot of time on those three things. So Blood Satellite, Good Suffer, and Vanguardist Journal. And with that, you know, you can find all the other affiliated links through there. But that's it. And I guess it can me and Meta Prime, you could find me on Twitter chatting with this guy.
Yeah, now we've got you in the chat group too. We got some interesting eclectic people there. So and that's a big part of what I'm trying to do. Is I am really trying to build this parallel movement. I've gone out west and I've met a bunch of people. People kind of know I'm on the East Coast. I kind of bump around here. But you know, and we've got some good mutuals who live up north. I might be going to visit soon. But you know, our goal is really like, you know, that next step is, you know, not hiding from our friends anymore, trying to build stuff, trying to, you know, set those KPIs, move things forward. And so
yeah, especially now more than ever, because there's a lot of people from the mainstream, these friends and family, they're lost as well. You know, they're starting to see people start to get tired of a lot of these narratives. Like people are just generally I'm not like necessarily a pro-Trump guy, but I think a lot of people are tired of like round 2 of Trump hysteria. Like we're doing this shit again, the exact same thing. You're seeing like people just giving up on DEI, like they gave up on COVID. Remember that they even just said, okay, we're just done, and then we don't talk about it anymore.
Yeah.
But there's fertile ground there where these people, there's a lot of people who are passionate, that are disillusioned, that I think are ripe to maybe introduce some new ideas to, more than before. And that's exciting. Just like you see like liberals pushing back against mass migration, the idea of replacement migration in the zeitgeist, we won a lot of battles. A lot of our narratives are mainstream. Narratives that we never would have thought would be mainstream have been mainstream. Okay, that's good. That's energy. That's momentum. But a lot of us weren't ready for that. A lot of us weren't ready for like Tucker Carlson to be saying our stuff. So it's like, well, what do we do now? There's something we can do, but we didn't plan ahead for that. But now 2024 feels exciting to me. And I think it feels exciting to others for that reason as well.
I agree. I think we got to lean into the energy. There's a lot of opportunity. And again, this is what I'm trying to do with my show too, is try to focus on what is that middle ground, that's going to allow that transition from people waking up from the mainstream delusion, getting fed up, even if they're late to the party, right? Like one of the things that I hate in the space is people who are like, well, we're not going to save those people. They're bad people, or, like there's no forgiveness or whatever. And it's like, yeah, sure. Like I'm not going to forgive, the execs over at Pfizer, there's a bunch of, there's a lot of people who are unforgivable, but when it comes to the average person, like I think we need to be building those roads across, and that's how we win long term. So
yeah, remember, a lot of these people, how much of a true believer were they ever really? Do we need more enemies? Do we need more? Do you like the people? Are we here because we're on the side of vitality? Are we here because we're on the side of life? Are we here because we are proposing a better solution? I'm not just here to dole out punishment. I get that wears you out. You lose your soul doing that. Now, there's a few people, but a few examples we made, but because there's always going to be evil people out there. But like, what do you want to do? Like, kill half of America? That's no fucking solution.
Yeah, I mean that was what the first article that I wrote was: live not in opposition to evil, but pursuit of good. Right, and I think that's the thing to me is like we need to celebrate that vitalism, celebrate those positive things, focus on your self improvement, and then when you go out into the world. I do think that there's definitely a place for like taking down the bad NGOs and fighting the good fight. But I think a lot of us, like the best things we can be doing is, supporting podcasts by buying merch or, like getting out there and, being in the community and, doing some volunteering or something like that, like writing content that you think is going to be valuable. The other thing too, is there's a lot of people, one of the other things is like mental health, right? In our community, it's not always the easiest. And so just reaching out, just being friendly, being a willing, ear to just, when I first got on Twitter, I was like hanging out with a bunch of sub 100 follower accounts, and we were all just really friendly with each other. And I think that goes a long way.
It reminds me of that meme. I'm going to butcher it and paraphrasing it, but it was a guy writing a tweet. He was saying like sending a tweet, hoping that a hot girl responds saying, "Man, I'm feeling down right now." And the guy responds is like, "Hitler rapist groiper," and it's like, "Hey man, how you doing? I'm here to talk."
Yeah. Oh, it's the friends. There's a reason the Apu meme is just so prolific. I think that's what people were looking for. It's like world's crazy. We're living in clown world, but we have each other, and I think that goes a long way. So
yeah. But I just want to say this has been an amazing talk. I had a really great time talking to you.
It's my pleasure.
Any other time you want to have me on, I'd love to come back on.
Yeah, I feel like we only scratched the surface. We didn't even get spicy. This one's going in front of the paywall. So
okay, I did my job. It's so easy to get spicy. The older you get, this is what we do. What got even white guys, you get a taste for spice as you get older. You start putting more cayenne pepper on things. So spice is the only thing that registers for me anymore. So it's very good that I didn't go down that road this time.
Well, I think there is a lot of fertile ground to cover that you don't have to get spicy, but trust me, my spice tolerance has only gotten higher as I've gotten older. So maybe we'll do one behind the paywall, and you'll find out in the meta chat just how spicy we can get.
So many guys who are just like, I'm so spicy, I'm at like Dune levels of stuff. Like, yeah, so we should kill AI and have a galactic jihad. It's like that's not even Fed posting. That's so up there. They don't know what to make of it.
Yeah, I say like you kind of come full circle, right? It's like you get crazy, you go down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole, and then like you realize actually, you should start a family and have a kid and like get a house and like mow your lawn and like that's what you should be doing, kind of.
Guess what, FBI? The Earth isn't flat; it's a fucking triangle. What now?
Yeah, it's a rhombus. It's yeah,
it's hollow and inside out. Arrest me.
That's the problem. Is like now it's become meta. It's like you just have these like higher levels. So like I've met some of the e-girls in person as well, and they're really funny because like they get ridiculous and aggressive on the timeline. They're just like kind of normal people, and they're just like, this is just so stupid, the attention stuff. And I'm just like, I know I'm playing this game, and I'm just trying to do it's just so like you can't say the things correctly anymore.
But then that e-guys show up and they're exactly the same. No, billions must die. I said it. I meant it. I meant it because I said it.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of LARPers in our space. There's a lot of people who, they would be LARPing whatever is the thing, but they just kind of found their way into the space. And so you got to be able to separate those people. But look, I'll take people LARPing the right ideas over people LARPing the wrong ideas. I'd say. So
Fucking the E guys show up. No, I have hand tattoos of Hyperborea. What did you think this was?
it's like, all right, Sparky.
Watch me
All right.
like right at the end zone start getting too spiced.
Yeah, what I'll do, this is one of the things that I'll do, is I always have an intro and an outro song, and I can just ramp the outro song, so it's too hard. You can't quite hear what we're talking about as it fades off. But awesome, yeah, this was great. I'll let you get some sleep. I really appreciate you coming on. Yeah, I feel like it was fated, as Stormy was like, you guys got to talk. Crude set us up, Prudentialist set us up, and yeah, amazing conversation. So hopefully we'll have some more time to connect in the future, and who knows? Maybe I'll make a trip up to the Great White North. But until then, really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're a busy guy and you got a lot going on. So yeah, very excited to just keep seeing you all in the cyberspace. And thanks everyone for listening. I always like to wrap up with it was never over, and we have never been more back. So we'll see you on the next episode of the Metacast. Thank you.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.